Yes.
The Leaf Spring Army sends its regards.
Hello, everyone. I'm the Enforcer, and I'm accompanied by Enforcer Matt.
And good evening, folks. It's Enforcer Matt, and welcome back to day 1439 of the War News stream. And tonight we have very big news yet again. We have seen that major explosions have erupted in the major Iranian port city as war threats have been escalating as of today. We've also seen that Russia is building up forces near the Finnish border, and also Iran has launched attack drills near the capital city of Tehran. And we have very big news, and it's good to see you all once again.
And of course, we're going to be covering the past 24 hours of news from around the world, as we have been able to get major developments from most corners of the globe, as we have heard in the Middle East today that the Islamic Republic of Iran has openly stated that they are ready for war, with members of the Iranian parliament chanting death to America, while missile exercises have been conducted by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' air defense forces around the city of Tehran and other regions of the country. Additionally, more explosions have rocked the city of Bandar Abbas, which is right next to the naval station that holds most of Iran's navy, and it appears that there may be some sort of on-the-ground covert operations that may be conducted at this point in time. Additionally, the Islamic Republic of Iran has issued NOTAMs over wider areas of the country in the midst of these ongoing air defense exercises as they try and prepare for the eventuality of the United States of America conducting a strike on the Islamic Republic of Iran. Additionally, we have heard that the Iranians have stated that they are, at the same time, willing to negotiate with the United States of America about the terms on which the President of the United States has mentioned prior, sending a diplomatic envoy to Ankara, Turkey, to engage in negotiations with the United States of America. However, the Iranians have already made it clear that these negotiations are going to go absolutely nowhere, and they're absolutely unacceptable, according to the Iranian foreign minister, which was made in a statement today, already showing that these attempts are being made in bad faith and are simply buying time for the Iranian government to further prepare for eventual U.S. strikes in their country. Multiple other intelligence agencies and officials, including some advisors within the United States, has also shared the credible information that the Islamic Republic of Iran is only attempting to get involved in limited negotiations in Ankara to buy time, and has absolutely no hope or attempt of trying to meet the United States at any of its talking points at any degree. While that's been going on, the U.S. has still been flying in more forces into the region, and the USS W.D. Black has now gone underway once again out of the Gulf of Aqaba after sailing to the port of Eilat within Israel. The Israelis have also convened a security meeting today, and the Israeli Defense Forces now state that an attack could happen anywhere in between 2 weeks to 2 months from now. Moving on from that major development inside the Middle East, the United States also appears to be leaning heavily into the possibility of some form of a special forces operation against Iran, as several C-130J Commando II Special Operations Force Command aircraft of the United States Air Force have been spotted in the British Indian Ocean territory of Diego Garcia, heavily indicating that they may be conducting or preparing for some form of a special forces operation against the Islamic Republic of Iran in the near future once strikes are approved. Meanwhile, the People's Republic of China has also had a meeting on security issues today with the Russian Federation, with the Russian Federation's Ministry of Defense and other higher-up officials of their Ministry of State also arriving in China today to discuss some form of important topics. It's unclear as to what those are, and we're generally going to be waiting to see what official announcements they make after that meeting is concluded, but we believe that it may be some sort of further cooperation between the Chinese and the Russians on the ongoing war in Ukraine, with China most likely pledging more dual-purpose support to the Russian Federation as the war continues to grind on with absolutely no end in sight. The Russian Federation also seems to be viewing this endless war as one that will lead to the complete demise and destruction of the Russian Federation. And much as has been expected for a while, we have been able to confirm by satellite photography that the Russian Federation is now building up a significant amount of forces near to the area of the Finnish border, with a large Russian buildup being seen in the city of Petrozavodsk near Lake Onega earlier today. It's believed that at the moment the Russian Federation is beginning to move larger assets into the area around the Finnish border, along near to the area of Estonia and the Baltic states, to be able to prepare for some form of a larger offensive against NATO, to be able to try and force a nuclear-armed confrontation, to then get concessions in a negotiated settlement afterwards. The Polish have also confirmed that their authorities closed down the northeastern airspace last night because the unidentified flying objects were in fact smuggling balloons that had been launched by the Republic of Belarus, once again showing that hybrid warfare is being used to cause significant amounts of damage and also a significant amount of risk to public safety over the skies of Lithuania and Poland alike. Meanwhile, the United States of America has further reiterated its statements that Cuba will fall here incredibly soon, once again showing that the United States of America has some form of an ongoing ambition or interest in seeing that the communist regime of Cuba is finally brought to an end after nearly 70 years of existence. The USS John F. Kennedy, which is the second Gerald R. Ford class carrier to have been built, is also undergoing sea trials at this moment and is expected to replace the USS Nimitz as a standing carrier within the U.S. Navy within the next year. Additionally, we have also been able to hear that within Ukraine, the Ukrainian armed forces have held the line today and have inflicted incredibly significant casualties onto the Russian Federation's armed forces, and we have also been able to confirm that the Russian Federation is already resuming attacks once more on Kyiv, and generally appears to be trying to violate the energy ceasefire that was made with the United States of America just several days ago. We have all of that news, and a whole bunch more that we have to cover over the course of tonight. I'm sure many of y'all can tell that tonight is another massive night of news, and we are of course going to be going as tradition dictates on this channel from the largest stories first into the smaller stories throughout the night. I also have to point out that tonight we have a fundraiser for Nova Ukraine because it is our Sunday night fundraiser, and of course we hope to raise a great deal of funds for Nova Ukraine as they've been doing absolutely incredible work inside of Ukraine, helping to save innocent civilians, men, women, and children from the clutches of the front lines and the brutality that the Russian army brings upon the civilians once they make it into the towns that they live in. With that in mind, we are going to be moving on into our news for the night, moving us first and foremost, once again, into the Middle East. The Islamic Republic of Iran has been in a general crisis mode, especially over the past few days, as the tensions within the area continue to rise. U.S. flights are continuing into the area at a very constant pace, which is showing us that the United States is still in the process at this moment of building up another large strike force against the Islamic Republic of Iran, very similar to the one that was seen last year leading up to Operation Midnight Hammer. As a result of this, we have been able to see that the Islamic Republic of Iran did declare a large number of NOTAM strikes throughout their country today. These are notices to airmen. Just in case if you are unfamiliar with what a NOTAM is, these close off a specific area of airspace and notifies general civilian aviation not to pass through, as live fire military exercises or some other form of sensitive government operation is going to be conducted within that area. We can see that these actually span a larger part of the country, including the northern regions, apparently due to drone activities that'll be happening near to the Azerbaijani border, which is very interesting. We also can see that there are 31 individual NOTAMs that have been issued across the entirety of the country for gunfire, most likely anti-aircraft defense gunfire, and we can also see that within a central part of the country, southeast of Tehran, and generally within the deserts, we have seen that there's also a larger NOTAM for rocket and missile fire, meaning that civilian aviation has to completely avoid these areas for the next foreseeable few days in the future, as the Islamic Republic of Iran is going to continue to conduct air defense exercises within these areas and try and at least prepare their forces as best as they possibly could for the eventuality of war with the United States. One thing that's incredibly important to notice, however, out of this NOTAM map is that out in the purple area for the UAV NOTAMs, this is right near to the Azerbaijani border, and I found this one incredibly interesting because this would suggest that right now the Iranians are trying to fly some sort of a high-altitude reconnaissance drone as close as they can to Azerbaijani sovereign airspace and try and get an idea of what that C-130J Commando II is doing in Baku at the moment. It seems as though this is catching Iranian attention, at least a flight of that C-130J, which we talked about several days ago, which landed in Baku, and was at least supposed at the time to possibly be preparing for special forces operations against Iran from Baku, and that has now gathered the Iranians' attention enough that they are now closing off an entire area of their airspace to send a drone up to try and figure out what exactly is going on in Baku, and if they can gather any further information about the U.S. military movements within Azerbaijan at the moment. The U.S. also does not only have the singular C-130J Commando II out of Baku in Azerbaijan. The United States Air Forces have also started to move a larger amount of aircraft into the area of the British Ocean, or Indian Ocean territory, or otherwise called the Diego Garcia facility. We were able to note that there is a higher amount of activity present at this airfield, and we also were able to, interestingly note, the presence of a couple of more MC-130J Commando IIs. These two right here. And this was incredibly interesting because the heavy presence of MC-130J Commando IIs, and I have to make sure to say the full name here because that is the specific designation of the C-130 Hercules, is incredibly rare to see in any larger number in most areas of the world and in most military operations. We didn't even see this number of MC-130J Commando IIs in Southcom's area of responsibility when we were preparing for the military operations against Maduro in Venezuela. This leads us to believe that the United States is apparently preparing, or at least wanting the public to believe, that they are preparing some form of a larger special forces operation, hence the need for, at least at the moment, what we can visually confirm, 3 MC-130J Commando IIs that are currently within Indo-PACOM and CENTCOM's command at the moment. This is an incredibly large buildup, I would have to say that without a doubt, and it does also appear that this buildup is continuing in other areas of the region, as we also were able to note that there were more flights into the Middle East, with another C-5 Galaxy flight making its way out of Ramstein Air Base in western Germany today, and into the area of the Middle East once more. We do not know exactly what these C-5 Galaxies are carrying, at least for now, but we would generally assume that in the roughest instance of an estimation that we can make, they are definitely carrying something along the lines of a THAAD or a Patriot missile defense system, or multiple parts of those missile defense systems, and dropping them off in the Middle East to prepare for larger defensive capabilities by the United States of America. However, some news has come out today in the midst of these ongoing preparations that are generally showing us, at least at the moment, that there is some skepticism, at least by some U.S. officials at the moment, about the ongoing military operations that could be conducted here soon. The U.S. military is ready to carry out limited strikes on Iran, but is not prepared for the decisive attack sought by the president, with no strike expected in the near term. U.S. officials say limited strikes could be ordered immediately, but a major operation will require significantly stronger air defenses to protect Israel and U.S. interests. The United States is deploying additional Patriot and THAAD systems across the Middle East as a Iran is expected to respond with heavy ballistic missile fire if large-scale strikes begin. At least by this statement, it seems to be showing us that, for now, the Islamic Republic of Iran is not planning on conducting any larger, well, the United States of America at least, is not planning on conducting any form of large attacks against the Islamic Republic of Iran, at least for now, if we were to take this information at face value. But it does seem to be showing us, at least at the moment, that the United States is probably trying to move more air defense forces into the area. Hence the reason why we're seeing the C-5 Galaxy and C-17 flights being conducted basically every other day of the week. I'd also have to point out another important facet of information to all of y'all, in that the United States of America is once again largely starting to waffle on this at the moment. I do have to lay out the groundwork that has led up to this moment for all of y'all here, in that the Islamic Republic of Iran has seen that this military action began against them because they killed 30,000 innocent people in the streets that were protesting against their government. After that massacre, well, actually before that massacre was even conducted, the President of the United States had publicly stated that if any Iranian protesters were killed, the United States of America was going to strike the Islamic Republic of Iran for crimes against humanity and the suppression of free speech. Those were the specific statements made by the President in the very early part of this year, before the massacres began on the 8th and 9th of January. Then on the 8th and 9th of January, the Islamic Republic of Iran moved forward with conducting massacres across the entirety of the country against those that were protesting, and we were able to confirm that around 20 to 30,000 people were killed in that instance, and we believe that the numbers are still climbing day over day. With that in mind, the current reason for war that the United States had already prior stated was that if the Iranian government killed any Iranian citizens that were involved in the protests, the United States was going to conduct strikes. The United States, even at this moment, a month later, is still not ready to conduct strikes, at least according to the information that came out today. And not only that, the United States has completely moved the goalpost away from the 30,000 people who were killed in the streets, largely due to the U.S.'s insistence that they remain in the streets because they would be guaranteed protection by the United States government and military if they ended up massacring the citizenry. And now the President of the United States has completely moved this into a nuclear weapons negotiation, instead of anything to do with what's happened on the ground inside of Iran, which the President pledged, if it had happened, and it did, and we have endless confirmation of it, that the United States of America would conduct strikes on the country. It does appear that a lot of people are talking at the moment about whether or not the U.S. is ready to conduct extensive strikes on Iran at the moment. We do understand that there is a large amount of forces within the area, and for that reason alone, it would appear that even right now we are in a pretty decent footing to be able to conduct strikes. But a lot of people are wondering whether that is necessarily true or not, or if the U.S. is wanting to build up even further offensive and defensive forces in the region to prepare for those strikes. And Matthew, what are people thinking about that? And what are you thinking about that as well?
Okay, so that is the big question tonight. What is the likelihood right now of these extensive campaigns that we're hearing about that could allegedly happen on Iran in the near future? What is the likelihood of such an extensive campaign? And 59% said the U.S. is likely ready for it, while 18% said the U.S. can only do limited strikes, and 17% said the U.S. simply isn't ready for such an attack. And I would say, I think there's a lot of disinformation going around right now, and that's probably intentional to confuse everybody, because we've seen a massive deployment. We've seen stratotankers, fighter jets, all kinds of naval vessels, including carrier strike groups. We have a lot of assets that have been going to the region. We've even seen buildups at Diego Garcia, which is a base in the Indian Ocean, which is typically a precursor to major attacks on Iran. So I don't see this as being limited strikes. In fact, I see this as being an extensive campaign on Iran, and that seems to be all the preparations that are being taken is for an overwhelming system of strikes against the IRGC targets and the government targets. So I think they actually are ready for it. I think they're trying to confuse people so that way people really aren't on the full track of where the U.S. is actually going with this, and I'm with the 59%. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would be with the 59%. I think that the U.S. is well and truly prepared to be able to conduct strikes on the Islamic Republic of Iran, because the Israelis in the 12-day war were dealing with about the available air forces in the region that we currently have in the area right now on the carrier strike group and all of the other aircraft that we know and believe are currently in the area right now. If the Israelis were able to get the full-on jump on the Iranians in the 12-day war and conduct airstrikes across the entirety of the Islamic Republic of Iran with the limited air force they have at their disposal, that means that the United States Air Forces are more than capable of conducting a strike at this moment right now without waiting. The reason why we're hearing these statements coming out today is to make the Iranians possibly try and believe that the strikes won't be happening soon. They'll be happening far later out in the future, although we definitely possess the ability to conduct the strikes right now. One thing that is very important to remember, however, is that while we are most certainly ready to conduct strikes right now in the region, there is, while my esophagus just collapsed right there for no reason at all, but there is a larger and more important reason as to why this is going to be taking some time, and that has to do with the civilian administration within the United States. The civilian administration within the United States of America, aka the office of the president, is incredibly indecisive whenever it comes to acting swiftly in a foreign policy development. We saw that with Venezuela. It took 4 months for the final approval to be made to go and grab Maduro. That could have been done in about less than a month or a month and a half in reality, because we had all of the forces present and available in that area from about the first month and onwards through that entire situation. And we've also seen very similar occur within the Middle East during the 12-Day War and leading up to Operation Midnight Hammer. That all leads us to know that generally, while the U.S. is ready to conduct strikes at the moment, everyone's basically waiting on the president to finally make up his mind and probably go through 9 negotiation attempts with the Iranians, which has absolutely no chance of succeeding, before we actually start to conduct strikes on the Islamic Republic of Iran. So I would believe...
You know, the crazy part is there's been disinformation even about that speculation, because you're right when you said that. The U.S. did the exact same thing previously. They said, oh, we're willing to negotiate with the Iranian officials. And then, shortly after that, a massive attack occurred on Iran, targeting their nuclear sites. So it was misdirection the first time, but now we're hearing from Israeli sources that they said that they think the president's serious this time about negotiations. They don't think he's just doing it for a feint to trick the Iranians. They think that he's doing it to actually negotiate. So I don't think the Israelis truly know what's going on either this time. I think the Israelis are actually being kept in the dark, which is actually somewhat surprising, because usually they have a lot of headwind and also a lot of pre-information about what's usually going to happen in the region. But I think this time, I don't think they really know.
Yeah, I would have to say I don't really think they know exactly what's going on in Israel at the moment, which is really interesting, because usually they get the scoop on literally everything. But outside of that, though, I would have to say that it's going to be a little interesting to see how this is going to go, because the Israelis, like we're saying right now, seem to be completely in the dark. Netanyahu had a Security Council meeting today with the defense minister, the head of the Mossad, and also the IDF chief of staff, but we also then heard from an IDF official not that much longer after the meeting ended that we estimate that an American attack against Iran could take place within a period of 2 weeks or 2 months. In short, they don't know. So it looks like the Israelis, at least according to their public statements, might have been led completely into the dark by the United States and is getting basically no information as to when this might be planned to be going down. The Israelis also believe that current attempted negotiations may be seriously attempted by the United States, which in short is a fool's errand, and I'll make sure to get you all into Iran to explain why that would be a fool's errand. Inside of the Islamic Republic of Iran today, we were able to hear that they are generally not wanting to conduct any negotiations at all. According to an Iranian diplomat, they stated that no negotiation is possible under the current situation. The president's conditions for negotiation are unrealistic and unnegotiable. That was a statement made earlier this morning. Not long afterwards, we were able to hear that apparently the Ayatollah Khamenei then made this statement on Twitter, which I do have to say it appears that he finally has Wi-Fi in the bunker. And this is what Khamenei tweeted out on Twitter. What is the issue between the United States and Iran? The issue can be summed up in 2 words. This is much longer than 2 words, by the way. This is an entire sentence.
He's back to the what is it, the drunk tweeting or something. He's back to that crazy tweeting. I don't know what it is. I don't know if Khamenei's writing his own tweets. I can't really tell, and we don't really know in the public, but his tweets they get way more unhinged than this. Like, this is probably one of the least unhinged tweets he's put out.
I don't I like this. It can be summed up in 2 words. Okay, let's work on the 2-word rule. The United. Okay, there's the answer. Man, so now we have to read the full sentence that's not 2 words. The United States wants to devour Iran, because clearly we eat countries, you know, like, if you look at the world map, I mean, Germany's gone. It was eaten like a cookie with some milk back in the 1940s. Clearly doesn't exist anymore, you know, great point. The Iranian nation and the Islamic Republic prevent this. Like they prevent anything. I mean, like, what's kind of crazy is that they say that the United States wants to devour Iran. It's like, didn't they just massacre like 30,000 people 2 weeks ago? I would say that's more so devouring the Iranian nation than the United States ever could do. The United States, mind you all, at least in the Middle East, over the course of about 20 years, is believed to have produced something about 70,000 civilian casualties due to our military actions in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Iranians did half of that in about a week. So I don't really think that they have a good working metric here to say that the United States is the one devouring the Iranian nation. It seems as more so he's the one that's kind of devouring the Iranian nation. But I don't know. Maybe we're wrong on that. Maybe a massacre doesn't really count too much to people these days. But we also were able to hear that then they stated that they were willing to negotiate, and they were actually sending a negotiation team to Ankara because a U.S. official confirmed that a meeting between the U.S. and Iran could take place this week in Turkey. This is absolutely a waste of time. I already got to let y'all know that one, because we've gone through this for a year and a month now. 1 year and 1 month of this crap teaches you a lot. And this whole stupid idea that the president has to send negotiators to go do the deal-making thing because he's the art of the deal guy, it really gets incredibly old after a while, like it is today. Because we already know from all the statements the Iranians made today in their country that they have no will to negotiate with the United States, just like the Russians have no will to negotiate with the United States. But whenever anyone in Iran or Russia says like the sleeper cell words to the president, deal maker, make deal, then he goes, send a negotiation team, and then we send one out there to go waste time and buy our enemies plenty of time, and most likely in the course of days or weeks even, for each attempted negotiation that fails. And that's what's going to happen down here with Iran. They've already made it clear today, domestically, by Khamenei, by chief negotiators, by everyone else, they have no intent or will to negotiate anything with the United States. They already made that clear yesterday as well. They stated, we're not negotiating anything with nuclear weapons. That's completely off the table. We will do what we want, and if the United States wants to do something about it, they're going to have to fight us about it. They've made that exceptionally clear. There's no point in even negotiating if they're taking that stance. Yet, for some reason, the U.S. Department of State is still going to send out some guy to go to Ankara and talk to the Iranians about nothing. It's going to buy them probably a week. So it's like, I gotta say, it's absolutely ridiculous. But the Iranians, basically, folks, if you're an enemy of the United States these days and you want to just buy yourself time and end up in an indefinite loophole where the U.S. does not bomb you, just pretend like you want to negotiate a deal or make a deal or talk about how great deal making is. If you do that, you can buy yourself months, maybe even years, just doing that in an endless loop and pretending like you might actually want to talk about making a negotiated deal, but in reality you don't, and you're just wasting everyone's time. But beyond that, though, we did get to hear that within the Iranian parliament, it appears that they have nothing but goodwill towards the United States of America. They love the United States. We had this video come out today from the Iranian parliament, which was showing all the Iranian parliament members chanting, "We wish good health and good wishes to America." Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, they're actually saying death to America in a 1 minute and 40-second long endless chant of this in the Iranian parliament. Again, they basically get together and do nothing about passing laws. They just do this about every day. And they did this again today. Now, tell me that that's a country that wants to make a deal with the United States of America. The entire puppet parliament they have doesn't even like the United States of America. It makes it incredibly clear they hate us and hate everything about us. So why in the world? I mean, this goes on for 1 minute and 40 seconds. I could play 10 seconds of this for y'all. Why in the world would we want to negotiate with a country like this? They clearly do not have our best interest in mind, and we already know from the Obama-era JCPOA that if we make any agreement with them about nuclear weaponry, they're simply just going to skirt around that agreement and pretend that they're adhering it and following it when they're not. We already know that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they're definitely not going to adhere to any agreement. Even the Europeans, like pretty much all the European countries, are warning the United States that whatever they try to negotiate with the Iranian officials, it's going to fall through. Like there's no hope that you can actually get them to adhere to an honest agreement, because the entire purpose of the IRGC and Iran's government is to deceive the West. That way they can basically fund ways to destroy us. So it's really wild with that. But also, by the way, what's up with these guys wearing like military uniforms in the parliament? Like, are all these guys military, or do they require require them to wear a uniform.
They kind of wear like this little quasi-military outfit, like all of them do, because they were part of the quote-unquote Islamic Revolution. You know, every revolution's got to have its goofy little like drabby uniform, like Fidel or Che Guevara or something like that. It's kind of similar to that.
Yeah, really. It kind of looks militaristic in here. Also, I don't know what's up with their cameras. It's like their cameras are like, what, 20 or 30 years old? This looks like footage from a different era.
You know, I gotta be honest with you, man. It is so hard. I just gotta be upfront with y'all. It is so hard to make a thumbnail about anything dealing with Iran because they have never heard of a high definition photo in Iran. Everything that they have over there for cameras or cameras in general, film cameras or picture cameras, they are usually taking the lowest quality picture possible, like maybe 400 pixels or something like that. It's unreal. But listen to these guys. I just want y'all to get the absolute real and hatred that these guys have towards the United States of America. So I'll let y'all listen to another 15 seconds of this.
Oh, look, they're swarming.
You know, they sound
Hey,
like...
what, did they say that about their own people, too? Because the only people that's getting death is their own people. They're literally wiping their own out. So they're literally, they might as well chant that against their own people at this point with as much as they care, which is basically none.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, honestly. Like, it's absolutely insane. And for some reason, folks, this is a country that we believe we can make a deal with. Now, tell me this. If you had an entire parliament of a country come together and chant "Death to America," would you as an American believe that this nation is one to be trusted, or this government, more so, is one to be trusted? And I tell you that anyone who would say yes would be stupid. You don't even have to ask that question and actually give an opinion of, I think they could be trusted. There is no reason to trust something like this. If a whole group of people gathered around and chanted that they wanted you to die, would you ever say, hey, could you make sure to feed my dog while I'm gone? And also, here's the keys to my house. Can you go drop the mail off from my mailbox on the kitchen counter for me as well? No. You wouldn't do that to a people who were saying that you ought to die. You would assume they probably burn the house down and take the dog out. Why in the world will you ever trust a group of people like this in a government like this? That would make no sense at all. I don't even know why in the world the United States is even trying to entertain the idea of negotiating with a state that sponsors terrorism and largely exists and operates as a terrorist state. That's clear and obvious by what they're doing in the Iranian parliament, and it's even more so clear with what the Europeans are stating, according to what they have been hearing. A European official in contact with Iranian officials stated that Iran's leadership has closed ranks after the crackdown, and earlier unease over the use of force has been set aside amid U.S. threats, with the Iranian official who spoke to the European informant stating that we are ready for a total war. Meaning that the internal position in the Islamic Republic of Iran's government is that negotiations are simply to buy time, and the end goal is an eventual confrontation or conflict with the United States within the region. Whether they will lose that or not is not the question. The question is, are they going to bend the knee to the United States? And their answer is resoundingly no. And they're just going to try and run circles around the United States to buy themselves some extra time while they prepare for that eventual military action against the United States, whatever that action may end up becoming. It appears that a lot of people are talking about another major development that has happened further south within the country and within Bandar Abbas. There was an explosion that happened here yesterday, and a second one has happened again, which is starting to lead a lot of people to wonder what's actually going on here in the city. Bandar Abbas is home to the Iranian Navy's largest port, which not only operates all of these wonderful fishing boats, but also operates the Iranian Navy's destroyers, if I can find one for y'all, right over here. So you get fish, and you get Iranian naval vessels all in the same place. It's like a buy one, get one free deal. Not only that, we also were able to see that a secondary explosion happened in the city today. And it's leading us to believe that there might be something greater going on here in Bandar Abbas than simply gas pipeline explosion. Because once again, they don't happen this often. But here's the clip.
A little smoky. It's another apartment building too. It's kind of interesting that it's another apartment building from the looks of it. I wonder really what is up with that, because I don't think it's gas explosions. I think at this point people can pretty much rule that out, because you wouldn't have so many happening back to back like this, especially in Bandar Abbas. It's happened in 2 days in a row at this point, pretty widespread. So yeah, I think at this point we can conclude it's intentional, but we're not really sure what the purpose is behind it.
Yeah, I would have to say it looks like Matthew. There's a song that I've heard being sung on the streets of Bandar Abbas. Have you heard it lately?
I haven't.
You better watch out. You better not cry. You better not pout. I'm telling you why. The Mossad is coming to town. But beyond that,
Man,
though,
I'll
I
tell
get,
you what, the Mossad, they're definitely there, that's for sure.
man, I got to tell you, I think they're in there kind of deep. But a lot of people have been talking about the second explosion that's happened in Bandar Abbas for the second day in a row. And a lot of people are wondering, is Walter White cooking in that apartment? Or does it appear that there is something larger going on here within Bandar Abbas? And Matthew, what are people thinking about that? And what are you thinking about that as well?
Okay, so what is the objective behind these explosions that we're seeing erupt in Bandar Abbas? And yesterday we saw them erupt across several major cities inside of Iran. So what is going on with the situation? 50% said it's intended to destabilize Iran, while 21% said it's to target top officials, and 15% said it's likely to scare Iran into talks. And I have a very strong feeling, like we said yesterday, that these explosions are probably not gas explosions. They're probably some form of covert sabotage by agents on the ground. It could be Israeli agents, it could be U.S. agents. We simply don't know. And another possibility is it could be Iranians that are going around causing this chaos as well on behalf of a foreign intelligence group. So I think it's intentional. I think that's one thing that we can conclude with pretty good certainty. And I would say it seems like there's really no targeting of any top officials that we've really heard about. We heard some rumors that the IRGC naval commander was allegedly targeted the other day, but we never got any confirmation of that. So I would say I'm with the 50%. I think largely it's intended to destabilize Iran and basically scare them into possibly talking. But Enforcer, what say you?
I'd have to say that I'd be with 50%. I believe that this is most likely some sort of destabilizing operation within Iran that's being conducted by some form of an intelligence force, maybe the CIA or the Israeli Mossad, that is attempting to start to sow the seeds of paranoia within the country. When explosions like these start to happen often, not only does it start to make the public paranoid, but it also makes the internal security services paranoid. This might make them increase their patrols, increase the amount of time that their officers are on duty, and that will all start to wear them down and get them a little bit more exhausted and tired in the meantime while we're still waiting to conduct these strikes. Generally, we're trying to get them hyped up mentally enough that they never really take a break and they start to wear themselves down preemptively to when we conduct strikes, they're not going to be that fast in reacting or that effective in reacting because they're going to be absolutely exhausted at that point. And I've actually heard, folks, that the Mossad operatives down there in Bandar Abbas, they have been doing some hard work. They put on the uniforms of those little gas meter guys from the gas company and they come around and they go, "Oh, shalom, salam alaikum, I'm here to check your gas meter." And then they go in there and they check the gas meter. And, usually they find that they apparently got a little bit too much gas. You can see the end results down there in Bandar Abbas quite often. But that's what we would assume at the moment, because there isn't really any other good explanation for the high rate of explosions that are happening in Iran at the moment outside of this. There is something else that's going on in the meantime, though, and we do want to make sure to confront this one at the head, because there were a large amount of air defense drills happening around Tehran today, and there were also some other explosions that were happening as well. And a lot of people were wondering, well, what's going on with this? And we do have to tell y'all. So here's the little clip. So in that, you could hear air defense fire, but you could also hear some other explosions as well. The audio is pretty faint. But we have been able to find out that right now within Iran, from about the 1st of February to the 11th of February, it's basically kind of like a pseudo-national holiday within the Islamic Republic of Iran, because this is actually when the Ayatollah returned from exile back into Persia to come and overthrow the Shah back in 1979. So this is generally kind of like an important time for the actual diehards of the Islamic Republic, and they celebrate that by firing off fireworks. So in the middle of the air defense fires drills, there are fireworks going off. So if you get some videos that come out of Tehran or other major cities, and it sounds like an explosion, but it doesn't really sound like a really strong explosion, it's highly likely that it's most likely fireworks being fired off by diehards of the Republic that are celebrating the return of the Ayatollah from exile. But moving on from that, we also were able to get a little bit of extra news out of at least the U.S. government today, and I can't really show y'all the clip, but I can read y'all what was said, because this is something I'm going to have to say, folks, is really going to be getting on my nerves here. According to pretty important guy within the Congress these days. He's a senator from a specific political party. He's been a very big one in getting out and speaking about the Iranians getting out and protesting. He's also a pretty big supporter of Ukraine as well. But here's what he said today. He said, keep protesting, and the president says help is on the way, and unlike the past administrations, he's a man you can count on.
Oh man, they're going to do it again. That's crazy. They're saying that again because we do know the first one. The Iranians feel that they got betrayed because when the first statements were made that help was on the way, help never arrived for the Iranians, and the Iranian government proceeded to wipe out tens of thousands of people. So I don't know why you'd want to repeat that statement considering the bad connotation of the first one and it resulted in death. I don't know why we'd want to repeat that in the United States. It seems like it's encouraging people to once again go on the streets of Iran and potentially get chopped down by the regime.
Well, guaranteed get chopped down by the regime because the enemy of God declaration is still out there. So if you go on the streets, you're pretty much going to get shot inside of Iran at this point. Now, I got to say this. I don't get into the whole domestic politics of anyone involved in the Congress or whatnot, but he was the main proponent during the last time this happened, earlier this month, well, earlier in January, for everyone to get out in the streets and protest. And 30,000 people died. We don't know how many of them would have been out there if it wasn't for the U.S. saying go out there in the streets, because it was this guy and the president that were saying that. Now, he's saying it again. This is after 30,000 people died, and the president's completely abandoned avenging these people like he said he was going to do if they did get shot and killed. Now he's telling them to go back out in the streets and do it again. So if there are any Iranians that ever watch this show, I'm just going to be completely upfront. I would not count on the word of any U.S. official to go out in the streets and risk your life for. It would be an absolute waste of life. It would be. Because the president of the United States has pretty much made it incredibly clear he's not going to avenge any of the 30,000 people who have already been killed. So if you go out in the streets and risk your life and get shot, no one's coming to avenge you at this point. So I wouldn't really go out there for the United States asking you to go out there. I would go out there because you feel compelled to go out there anyways. Otherwise, you're probably going to end up just wasting your life and then ending up with no one coming around trying to avenge you anyways in the future. And I wouldn't say that unless we had already seen that, because 30,000 people dead and the president's completely acting like that didn't even happen now. I mean, that kind of says a lot about, why you really shouldn't listen to that sort of a deal. And I just saw someone say, don't demoralize them. Well, I mean, what are we supposed to do? Tell them to go out in the streets when the U.S. president's made it clear he doesn't care that 30,000 people die and let another couple of thousand people die so that way they don't get demoralized? Like, I understand that a lot of people are looking at this as being the Islamic Republic of Iran and they're an enemy of the United States, and that's true. But at the same time, we're not going to sit there and have a whole bunch of innocent Iranians' blood on our hands just so that way we could say we didn't demoralize them all, and we basically hyped them up into running out into the streets into their impending doom and death, knowing that the U.S. military isn't going to be there to back them up or help them. Why in the world would we do that? I mean, honestly, it's more demoralizing, to be entirely honest with you. There's no less of a demoralizing statement to be made than mine when the U.S. military didn't show up when it was promised that it would show up when they were all getting shot and killed. That's probably the most demoralizing thing that can happen, more so than me telling them, for the sake of your own life, considering that no one is going to show up to help you, maybe don't go out there in the streets and get yourself shot, because nobody's going to come for you when you get shot. So I hope that addresses that the best I can. And I also got to say, U.S. officials have got to understand at some point, because I'm as pro-American as it gets, and I look out for American and Western interest. But here's the thing, folks. While I look out for American and Western interest, life is taken with purpose. You don't just tell people to go out there in the streets and lay down their lives knowing that no one's ever going to come and help and save them. You don't do that. That's wasting lives uselessly. That's completely pointless. And I don't really know why in the world we would be behind that and be behind making statements like that when we can already see that the president isn't backing them up with military support. And also, someone just said, are you blind? The U.S. forces are all around Iran. No, I'm not blind, but I'll ask you this. Are you blind? Has the U.S. forces bombed anyone in Iran yet for what they have done to the Iranian people, the 30,000 who have been killed so far? No. And let me ask you this as well. Has the United States continued to make it clear that we are operating against the Islamic Republic of Iran because of the massacres they conducted against their own people? No. We've completely buried that, at least on our official statements from the President and the Secretary of State. We've moved entirely on to their nuclear weapons development programs. So if we're going to do that, there's no point in encouraging people to go out on the streets and die, considering that we have an entirely different justification for bombing Iran at this point, which is their continued nuclear weapons and research. So moving on out of that, we are going to be moving on into a couple of more developments that we did get out of the Middle East today. Just one more, really, before we move on. As in the port of Eilat within southern Israel, we were able to see that the USS Arleigh Burke, well, actually, the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, the USS Delbert D. Black, was spotted today within the area of Eilat, which is in southern Israel. Apparently, it's now underway once more, but it did take a little bit of a shore leave within this area, most likely to resupply, and it's back on the way underway somewhere within the Red Sea. So that's what we know at the moment. And I also got to say, that's a neat little patch. A Space Commandos patch, or a Space Cowboys patch, I mean. That's pretty cool.
That's pretty cool right there, I will say.
Man, I gotta say, pretty neat, all things considered. But with that in mind, we do understand that the Delbert D. Black is within the area and is conducting some pretty significant operations right now. So with that, it is time for us, folks, to move on out of the Middle East. But before we do, because we do have some bigger news to cover inside of China and also within the United States of America and within Europe, we're about to be moving on up into the news up around the area of the Finnish border. Before we get to that, though, I do want to make sure that we talk about that fundraiser. And Matthew, what in the world has the fundraiser gotten to?
All right, so right now it's currently just shy of about $1,400 raised. So it's getting very, very close. It's actually over the 50% mark to the goal of $2,500. So it's doing fantastic tonight. A very fantastic fundraiser, if I do say so myself. But in the meantime, though, it's time to call off some of the top donors of the night. We've had some big ones coming in so far. First off, a big shout out to Pat Bomar, who put in a $110 donation to the fundraiser. And a huge shout out to Pat for helping to make that possible and helping us to reach the goal. Also, by the way, a Truck and Chef just threw in a 500, literally right second. A huge shout out to Track and Chef for by far the largest one of the night so far. And we are now at almost 1,900 raised as of right this second. And also, getting back to our list, a huge shout out to Rose, who threw in a 100, as well as a Truck and Chef who threw in another 100. Then we had a 100 from Pleasure Burn, as well as a 50 from Wubba, as well as a 50 from Samuel Sizelmansky, as well as Old Warrior Fella, and Ella MC Wills Nafo, as well as Mark Ead, Cheryl Jones, and Chef Danny B. And a huge shout out to not only the top donors that we've just called off, but everybody that's thrown in any amount of support. A huge shout out to you all for helping us to get very, very close to that goal. I think we're just about $600 shy of it right this second, so doing fantastic. But Enforcer, what say you?
And I'd say that is absolutely incredible stuff right there. And I got to give a huge shout out to everyone, especially including Truck and Chef, who just threw in a $500 donation to the fundraiser, because that is absolutely incredible. And it's crazy to believe that we're getting so close to $2,500 raised on this fundraiser for Nova Ukraine, which is an absolutely incredible cause, because they helped to save a large amount of lives inside of the area of Ukraine. And so I gotta say, incredible thing to see, a great thing to know that the Lee Spring Army is continuing to support these fundraisers, and hopefully we'll be able to see that we hit the fundraiser goal here incredibly soon. And I hope that we certainly will, folks, because it's going to be getting on real close at this point. Real close, that's for sure. But before we move on into the rest of our news, particularly the major news coming out of the Finnish border regions, I do want to make sure that we get a couple of questions from the chat, because right now, folks, we have about 16,000 people here live, and we have had about 80,000 people watch this show in about the first 50 minutes, which is pretty crazy to see. And I want to make sure that we try and make sure to chit-chat with at least a couple of y'all and have a couple of questions answered from the chat. So, Matthew, what do we got?
All right, so jumping into a few live chat questions here, we do have one from none other than DT, who said, do you think that Iran even has a real chance against the United States military?
In reality, they really do not, because Iran does not possess any competent surface-to-air missile capabilities. And that's really the main issue with most modern countries, especially our enemies, is that they do not have any real air defense capabilities, at least compared to the United States of America. The S-300 and S-400 air defense missile systems, which are some of the most competent and advanced that we would assume exist within the Axis powers, have actually been proven through multiple different military encounters, including the 12-Day War and the U.S. raid into Venezuela to capture Maduro, to be wildly ineffective, at least in terms of their ability to detect incoming air targets and to be able to properly intercept them. So the general reality is that they don't really stand a chance for that reason alone, because U.S. military doctrine exploits that Achilles heel of every single nation that we ever go up against. The U.S. emphasizes superiority of firepower through an air power doctrine. So to explain how that actually works outside of the technical term is that how we fight a war is that we will hammer a enemy air force and ground air defense force into the ground, basically into smithereens. And once we do that, then we send in all of our other strike aircraft to start picking off people on the ground. So at that point, after we knock out their air defense and their air force, so basically any actual resistance against the U.S. Air Force, then the U.S. Air Force starts bringing in our multi-role aircraft like the F-16s and the F-15Es and the F-15EXs, and even the F-35s these days. And we start dropping bombs on anything that's within view. So any grouping of IRGC officials and commanders, they'll get hit by a JDAM. Any anti-tank guided missile forces, they get hit by a JDAM. Artillery units will be slammed. Any convoys or supply units will be destroyed from the air. We basically start to pick away at the most important parts of every piece of an enemy military from the air. So nobody's really getting directly shot at or killed, and the amount of casualties or deaths that we can take at that phase of the military operation is incredibly low. And then once we break them down enough on the ground by wiping out any units that could pose a threat to the U.S. Army or the U.S. Marines or anyone else, then that's when we send the Navy in at littoral distances, which is basically onshore, and they start firing into Iran in high volume, and then the Army and the Marines start to push in on land. That's generally how our doctrine works in full form, using every single part of our armed forces. So in reality, the Iranians cannot really stand a chance against that, because to stand a chance, they would have to have competent air defense forces. Because it doesn't matter how good anything else is, if there's no way to defend them from being hit by an airstrike, they're all going to get destroyed, because a tank has no way to shoot down an enemy plane at 30,000 feet. So because the Iranians don't have any air defense or any real usable air force, they are not going to ever stand a chance against the United States of America in an actual armed confrontation. It doesn't matter how many ballistic missiles or drones they try and fire off into the Middle East at everyone else in the meantime, they will eventually reach the end of their days pretty quickly, especially the Islamic Republic, just because of superior air power. So I hope that does address that the best I can, at least in my opinion, or at least from what I would know about how U.S. doctrine works and how bad Iranian air defenses are. And with that, we are on to the next one.
All right, and the next one goes to GC, who said, do you guys think the U.S. will try and conduct land incursions into Iranian territory?
I would say that it would seem to be unlikely, but I would also say that it's not out of the possibility, especially seeing how many MC-130Js there are within the area right now. And if it wasn't for the number of MC-130Js in the area, I would say that it's decently unlikely. It's possible, but highly unlikely, because unlike Venezuela, the territory of Iran is pretty difficult to deal with. And let me see if I can get you all a terrain map here to show you all this. So there are some fairly significant mountain ranges that exist within Iran, and you can actually see them here on this screen. There's a giant mountain range along their entire southern coast and their western border, which would make any ground operations moving into that area pretty difficult to conduct. You would basically have to slam straight through that mountain range as quickly as you could, and there would be a decent amount of flaws with that sort of a strategy, because you could end up trying to move through so quickly that enemy forces end up slipping past you, and they end up behind you where they can threaten your supply lines and a whole bunch of other issues like that that could really slow down an offense and lead to greater casualties in the future. And there's also a very significant mountain range on their northern border as well, just north of Tehran. So really, unless if you were using Bagram Air Force Base, which is no longer available to the United States for military operations, because flying out of Afghanistan in that direction, while you would have to fly over the pretty mountainous areas of the Hindu Kush, you could get to the flat plains near Kandahar and generally eastern Iran, eastern Iran, although those are generally unpopulated areas, and try and do some military operations there. But in the reality of it, ground operations would just be really difficult to conduct because of the geography of Iran and the amount of mountains that they have. That's really the largest obstacle, and generally you'll actually see, if you ever look at military strategy, mountainous terrain basically stops an offensive. It becomes very difficult to fight in that sort of a terrain. You have to have specialized infantry, usually some form of mountain infantry, or mountaineers as they're called, to be able to fight in that sort of terrain. Usually there's a pretty decent chance of altitude sickness, especially if it's at a high enough level, because the strenuous sort of physical exertion at that lesser oxygen level within that altitude makes fighting incredibly difficult. And then on top of that, You also have to count that because it's a mountainous range, there's less infrastructure, meaning that there are less places to bring supply lines through, and there's also less offensive vectors, meaning that there's a lot of bottlenecks that you would have to fight through to get through those mountain ranges. So while military operations could be conducted on the ground, it's certainly not going to be a front-wide, wide-sweeping operation like you would see in the Gulf War or the Russian war in Ukraine. It wouldn't be like that. If anything, we'll probably use the MC-130Js to drop off special operations forces within limited areas with incredibly large numbers of air support above them to make sure that they can pretty much strike and destroy any incoming threats before they get to the special forces units on the ground. And that would probably be the only sort of operations that we would see, just because the terrain is so difficult. So I hope that does address that the best I can, at least from what I would know off the top of my head. And that's generally why we've also seen a lot of other analysts and experts from the United States highly advise against conducting any form of ground operations because of all those logistical and geographical hurdles that you would have to overcome, which could result in high casualties. But with that, I hope that does address that the best I can. And with that, we are on to the last question of this segment, and then we're going to be getting on into the rest of that news.
All right, and this one goes to Curmudgeon, who said, could the explosions in Iran be that one group starting up domestically?
And they're talking about ISIS?
I think maybe so, or possibly that other group, the Guardians or whatever the other group was, that one that made that video about rising up.
Oh, dang. Yeah, that was a confusing one because I was like, man, what group? Because there's the Kurdish group, there's the Balochistan group, there's the ISIS group, and then there's also the Golden Eagles or the Immortals, whatever they're called. There's a lot of different groups in Iran. We wouldn't believe that it's any one of those groups because usually they like to take credit for those sorts of attacks pretty quickly because that's how they get people to know about their calls and also try and get more recruits in the process. Because usually, funnily enough, when attacks like those are conducted, it's not actually conducted with the attempt of causing real damage because usually groups like that know that those sorts of attacks don't cause damage. What they do cause, though, are headlines. Those headlines gather a lot of attention. And so if there are any other radical people out there that would generally align with that group's beliefs, whatever group it is, they read that headline, they see what they did, and then they think, oh, that's a group I want to be a part of. And then they go and join the Kurds or the Balochistanis or ISIS or the Golden Immortals in the country, and then they start to join them and operate with them. So that's generally what those sorts of attacks would be for, and for that reason, if they haven't put out a public statement taking credit for the attack, that means it's highly likely they didn't conduct the attack. Because if they had conducted it, they would take credit for it because it would be more of a recruitment style attack to get their name out there in the press, more so than anything to try and actually cause significant or considerable damage to the Iranian government or its military apparatus. So I hope that does address that the best I can, at least from what I had known. And with that in mind, folks, it's time for us to move on into the rest of our news from around the world, and that's actually going to be moving us north, out of the middle of the east, and on up into the area of Finland. There's been some very concerning developments that we've seen today along the Finnish border, and we do want to make sure to get these out to y'all because this is something that we have been waiting for a little bit. In the past, the Russians have started to divert some more forces towards the Finnish border area, but from what we know, the number has fluctuated heavily, and generally it was more so a surge over a short period of time in the latter part of 2024 to really grab attention from the West, but then we saw that a large amount of those forces dissipated in number, and then were diverted into the Ukraine war because of the larger losses they were taking there. However, recently, near to the city of Petrozavodsk, which is near to the area of Lake Onega, which is right next to the area of Lake Ladoga, which is a very famous lake for many reasons, but Petrozavodsk has actually seen a marked increase of Russian armed forces that are present within the area. Some satellite photography that came out today has actually shown the change in force buildups, showing that some abandoned military facilities around the area have now been cleared out of vegetation and appear to be housing operational Russian military units, most likely attached to the Leningrad Military District. The Leningrad Military District is actually a bit of an interesting sort of a development in its own self, as the Russian Federation had actually streamlined its military district system back around the time of 2016 to be able to make it a lot more efficient and more westernized, therefore making it better in an actual outbreak of war. During that time, we saw that there was a southern military district, a northern military district, a western military district, and an Eastern Military District, or technically the Central Military District. There were only 4 military districts in the whole of the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation in 2024 took the Central Military District, which included Moscow and St. Petersburg, and split it into 2, creating the Moscow Military District and the Leningrad Military District out of the Central Military District. Let me go see if I can actually show you all a map of this. Let's see. Russian military districts. And here we are. This is the modern map of Russian military districts right here. And this doesn't seem that important, but I'll explain to y'all why this is incredibly important. Let me go show y'all what it looked like before this revisal. Let's see here. Here we go. So this is what it actually looked like. Actually, correction, no, that's not what it looked like. It looked like, well, what the hell? What the hell? What the hell's going on? Oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry. I forgot. They do this on Wikipedia. This is technically the Northern Fleet's command area, because there's so little Russian army units in that region. They actually just gave that to the Navy, but it's technically a part of the Central Military District, which is in red. But anyways, this is what the map looked like back in 2016 after the military reforms during that period. You had the Southern Military District. That's actually the one in brown that's charged with the responsibility of fighting the Ukraine war. They're headquartered out of Rostov-on-Don. Then the area in green is called the Northern Military District. This one's actually based, I believe, in Yekaterinburg, which operates generally within the majority of the Siberian region. And then you have the Eastern Military District, which operates the rest of Siberia and generally deals with any sort of border disputes that they have with China over their borders near Manchuria, specifically the little islands in the Amur River, and that's basically their only responsibility. Also, by the way, they are charged with the responsibility of flying bombers near to Alaska and freaking out our air defense. But the area in red's the important one. This was the Central Military District. This one was wildly important during that time as Russia's elite military forces. It pretty much covers the majority of the population areas where most Russians live inside the country, and because of that, it also had the cream of the crop of the troops. But in 2024, they revised the military districts to look like this. And notice how the Leningrad Military District was formed, and also notice that the Leningrad Military District is the only military district of the 5 where if it borders another country, it only borders NATO countries. That's it. The Moscow Military District only borders Belarus and Ukraine. The Southern Military District only borders Ukraine, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. The Central Military District, borders obviously Central Asian countries, primarily Kazakhstan, and then the Eastern Military District borders Mongolia and China. But the Leningrad Military District is special because it was designed in 2024 with the sole responsibility of preparing for a war with NATO and fighting a war with NATO. It also includes Kaliningrad, which is an incredibly important note as well. And this was what led us to know that over the next few years, the Russian Federation would start to be working on war plans to eventually invade a NATO state. Because the reason why they did that, and this explanation is probably really in depth at this point, but I'm going to keep explaining it because it is incredibly important. The reason why they did all of this was because the Central Military District served in purpose as what's called a surge district. So they would put the best troops in the Central Military District, and if a war broke out anywhere else, like say with Ukraine or Georgia or with China, you could take the elite troops of the Central Military District and just relocate them to another one. So the reason why they had to divide the Central Military District and create the Leningrad Military District is because it's now designed to fight NATO. That means that it's going to have pretty good troops, but they're also going to have to still need their elite troops in the Moscow Military District to divert to wherever they're needed the most, which might be either the war with NATO or the war with Ukraine, depending on the frontline situation at that moment in time. So that is why, because of that military district formation, we knew way back then that the Russians were already starting to talk about or at least plan for an eventual war with NATO because of how they were administratively structuring their armed forces. Now we're seeing on the satellite photography, especially at Petrozadovsk, they are bringing in more Russian forces into this area, which would give us an idea that they are still giving serious consideration to some sort of an eventual war with NATO. And they would clearly never win that war. But the reason why they would fight that war is because it would force the NATO and the NATO forces and the forces of the Russians into a nuclear confrontation. A direct war with the Russian Federation brings a very high risk of a minimum of a tactical nuclear exchange, which would be heavily devastating even at a tactical level. That means that there would be humongous pressure on the NATO alliance to reach the Russian Federation at the negotiating table and actually give significant concessions to the Russian Federation to try and avoid a nuclear conflict. That could be concessions just including Ukraine, or that could be concessions including Ukraine and the entirety of Eastern Europe. It's basically an all-in approach by the Russians. It's pretty much a gamble, because if the Russian Federation misjudges the Europeans, they get themselves into a tactical nuclear exchange at a minimum, and then possibly a nation-ending strategic nuclear exchange with Europe at a minimum. If they end up judging the situation properly, they might see that the Europeans back off in that major war and actually give significant concessions to the Russians to try and maintain some form of peace and not see that a nuclear war inevitably happens. So it does seem that the Russians are still leaning into that. Matthew, what are people thinking about that, and what are you thinking about that as well?
Okay, so now that Russia is trying to reopen a military base so close to Finland's border to station over 15,000 troops there, nobody's really sure exactly what the reason is behind the reopening of the base, but with it being in such close proximity to a NATO nation, it's got people obviously worried. So what are your thoughts? 59% said Russia is merely trying to intimidate, while 29% said Russia is planning to invade NATO, and 8% said it seems like something else. And I would say personally, there's a whole bunch of theories out there. People are saying that maybe it's being used to train troops to then send to Ukraine, but I would say that really doesn't make much sense because it's nowhere near Ukraine, and that's a long way to send soldiers to go train all the way up there near Finland. So I would personally say it seems like Russia is trying to put NATO on the defensive and put them on edge. I'm with the 58%. I don't really know if they're really planning to invade right this second. It's, of course, something that's on their bingo card, I guess you could say. But I don't think they would invade Finland. Like, Finland seems like a really stupid idea. If they're going to invade anything, it would likely be one of the Baltic states, because they try to cut it off with the Suwalki Gap and also try to corner it as well with the little other area they have. So I would say an invasion of Finland, I don't really see that. I think it's just intimidation. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would say that it's definitely intimidation, but there is a decent amount of strategic concern about the Finns being in the NATO alliance and possibly dealing with a war with the Russian Federation, because supply-wise, it actually might be difficult to supply the Finns a lot like the Baltics in a full-on war that the Russian Federation might conduct. Because while the Baltic states generally see that most of their supply lines pass through the Suwalki Gap by land only, and then through the Baltics elsewhere, which might be, the Baltic Sea elsewhere, which might be really difficult to get supplies and reinforcements into them over, Finland is in a very similar situation, because while they have a very significant land border with Norway and Sweden, this northern area of the country is not that developed, much like the supply line situation with the Baltics. And while they share a pretty sizable land border, it's actually not that big. Because of the Mercator projection, it makes it look far larger than it is, but this is only about 200 miles of shared border with Sweden. There is not a large amount of rail lines within this area, and rail lines would be the primary supply form that a NATO alliance would use in long-distance resupplies. And really quickly, let me show you all a railroad map of this area. Let me see here. So, oh, there we go. There we go. Let's see. Can I get this in higher definition? Ah, yes. I see you know your railroads well. Good one. And y'all knew it was coming back to railroads because they are very important. But if we pull up this map of the railroads of Scandinavia, y'all will notice something incredibly interesting on most of these maps. There is no direct rail access from Sweden to Finland, at least that we see on most of these maps. There is one shown here, but on most other maps, this actually does not exist. And from what I can tell, it's a little bit iffy as to whether or not this rail line is used heavily, and that means that it might not really be able to support any high volume of traffic. It also looks like it may be, from what I can tell, let me make sure to check. Oh, actually, it's double track. No, it's single tracked. So it may have a limited supply capacity, and that also means that for NATO forces and our concerns, there is only one rail line, largely, leading into Finland, and that would pose a major logistical bottleneck, because if the Russians started to fire off any Iskander missiles in that direction, and there were not air defenses to protect that rail line, they could knock out that rail line for a day or two on end during each attack, and make it to where that rail line is largely unusable. That means that NATO forces would have to drive over the border at a far slower speed, and also at a higher rate of consumption of parts and fuel, to make it into the northern part of Finland, and then have to eventually drive all the way down to southern Finland where the actual fighting would generally be. And that's a pretty bad sort of a logistical situation to be in. It's pretty much the same one as the Baltics. It's basically a Suwalki Gap without it being an incredibly small little part of land. It's just that most of this land is completely unusable in every way. It has either no major roadways going through it, or it doesn't even have any major rail lines passing through it. So generally, it could be pretty rough. It actually could be a pretty rough fight for Finland, much like it would be for the Baltics. One thing I do have to say, though, is that the Finnish military is not as small as any Baltic states military, but Finland still relies heavily on mobilized reservists. And reservists generally suffer from lower morale and also lower cohesion and less training than their regular army counterparts. And because of that, the Finnish military would have a pretty difficult time fighting the Russian Federation armed forces. It generally would be what we would call a peer-on-peer conflict, because the Finns would be about at the same level of morale and training as the Russian army would be going into this conflict, and probably the same equipment status as well. So it would be a pretty heavy slog going on in Finland, much like it would be in the Baltics. And that may be why they're starting to put some pressure this way, is because a lot of NATO analysts may notice that logistical bottleneck and may realize that Finland is in a fairly comparable situation, at least in supplies and reinforcements, to the Baltic states at the moment. So I would say they're definitely trying to intimidate, but the intimidation does come with some fangs behind it, at least in the reality that if they start a war, the Finns might be in about as tough a situation as the Baltic states might be.
Yeah, I would say so. It's definitely a tricky one to watch, but I just still don't think that they would invade Finland. Like, it seems like something they probably wouldn't do. They're just doing it probably for intimidation value, because it does have a lot of intimidation value, actually. Because even if you don't believe that Russia's going to invade, Finland has to get ready like they would, because you can't get caught lacking if Russia decides to invade or do something stupid. So it serves an objective. I just don't think it's going to end up in a real invasion.
Nah, I don't. At least for now, I don't think so. Probably in a year it might. But it is a pretty rough situation. I would have to say, folks, one thing that's going to be very important in a war with Russia is that NATO has to achieve complete naval dominance of the Baltic Sea and destroy any Russian submarines within the first 3 days, basically the first 72 hours to a week of that conflict. Otherwise, the situation in the Baltics and Finland is going to be absolutely atrocious. And I know a lot of people say, "Oh, well, the Finns, they have heavy morale and they also have a strong resilience." And I agree. I mean, every Baltic state and Finnish state is a lot like Finland. Well, I mean Ukraine. But the problem is, though, is that Ukraine has gotten a lot of Western support. A load of it over the years, because they have a direct land border and an easy supply line with other NATO countries and the United States historically. And because of that, that's given them a great edge in the war against the Russian Federation. The Baltics and Finland do not have that luxury. Their supply lines are incredibly small. They're incredibly, I guess you could say, vulnerable. And generally, that's not a good situation to be in. No amount of morale can help you out if you run out of ammunition and if you run out of guns. That's just the reality of the situation, and if you run out of reinforcements. And that's generally the problem that I'm seeing right here. Now, fighting spirit is one thing, but logistics is another. Because in reality, folks, logistics is what wins a war. It doesn't matter how much fighting spirit you have. Because you have the fighting spirit of a bull, but you don't have a rifle to go to the trenches with, you're going to be pretty bad off against the guy who doesn't want to be there but has a rifle. That's really more so the reality of it, putting it in the simplest of terms. So we would have to find a way. I'll be entirely honest with you. I would consider this to be a NATO imperative, that a second main line is opened between Sweden and Finland within the north, and that we also see that there is a permanent NATO naval patrol within the Baltic Sea, so that way, if war breaks out, whenever it may break out, NATO naval forces are already in the Baltic Sea and have generally locked that down. Another important thing that NATO could do to try and avoid the Russians wreaking hell on the naval corridors that we would be using to supply the Finns in the Baltic states would be to set up some sort of a submarine detection perimeter within the Gulf of Finland between Tallinn and Helsinki. It's not that large of an area. It's only about 35 miles across. And if we lay down some underwater microphones and maybe some other forms of detectors against Russian submarines, we could easily catch any Kilo-class submarine that's trying to leave Kronstadt and head out into the Baltics in general, and then destroy them once they make it out there. So I think that probably is something that NATO should start focusing on, because if we're counting on the land corridors to save the Baltics and Finland, that might be a hopeless cause, to be entirely honest. It might cost a lot more lives and a lot more ground than could have been seen if we controlled the Baltics outright during the whole conflict. So, with that, I hope that does address that the best I can, at least in my opinion. But we also were able to hear that the Polish air authorities have confirmed that the UFOs were smuggling balloons. They were
Oh
smuggling
man.
balloons.
So that confirms our suspicions from yesterday. Then that means that Belarus is expanding from not just the Baltic states. Mainly Lithuania was the one experiencing these balloon incursions left and right. They're now expanding that to Poland, which is a lot more serious because, of course, Poland being a top supporter of Ukraine, that has a little bit more implication to it. So I wonder what they're actually trying to do with Poland because these balloons could be carrying surveillance payloads. We simply don't know exactly what these balloons are carrying on them. They could be trying to spy and see if there's stuff on the border. That could be what Belarus is doing. We just simply don't know. But it could be possibly cigarettes, maybe, but we just don't know.
And that is something interesting to note right there. And also, I just saw someone say, and this is something that's an age-old discussion with the Finns. Someone always has to come in and say, "You don't know anything about the Finns. You don't know what you're talking about, and they're not well, and they're incredibly well trained and well armed." Maybe, but here's the problem, though. If you're not a full-time soldier, it does not count. And let me go pull this up really quickly. How in the Finnish mobilization term? Let's see here. How long? So, let's see here. Conscription in Finland. We want to find how long the conscription service is. So, it appears that a conscripted service in Finland lasts for 1 year. Now, in Russia, they have something wildly similar. That's called contract Niki. Actually, conscript Niki. And that means that they is conscripted by the Russian Federation's armed forces to serve in the Russian army for 1 year. Now, let me ask you this. How well has that posed the Russians with 1 year of military service and 1 year of military training against the Ukrainian armed forces, which going into the war in 2022 were an all-professional and all-contract force? It didn't bode them that well. And I know that a lot of people have a great deal of national spirit, but there is something about the practicality of having a full-time military force that is far better than a militia. A militia does not count and is not as effective as a full-time fighting force. That is not an opinion, that is a hard-on fact. If you are not training and operating as a professional soldier every single day of every single year on a long contract duration like 4 years, you are not going to be up to the snuff of a 4-year full-on professional contract soldier in Britain, Germany, the United States, or elsewhere. There's no way to do that because those soldiers go through endless amounts of training. They go through endless amounts of drill. They go through endless amounts of experience. And there is no way that a Finnish soldier serving for 1 year and then being a reservist for the rest of his life has any way to stack up in military competency against a German, Polish, British, French, or an American full-time soldier. There's no way that that's the case. If that was the case, everyone else would be doing that right now because it would be wildly cost efficient. Because then everyone's working as a part-timer and they don't have to be paid a full-fledged salary like we pay everyone here in the United States military to be a professional soldier. And I think that's where a lot of people are kind of missing the boat here. And also, let me make sure to try and find the equipment that the Finnish Territorial Defense Forces would have. And let's see here. Trying to see if I can find that. Finnish conscript equipment. Let's see if we can find what the units of the Finnish conscripts would be equipped with. Let's see here. So they would be equipped generally as armed citizenry, basically. Because it appears that most territorial defense forces will be equipped with shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, a very minimal amount of man-pads, and outside of that, mostly assault rifles, and that's about it. That is less than a motorized unit. That's basically what the Baltics are able to raise when they start conscripting troops, because if they're well-equipped and trained, here's the minimum that they would have to be equipped with in the modern day. They would have to be equipped with some equivalent of an infantry fighting vehicle, which the Finns don't have thousands of those on the tap to just start equipping dozens or hundreds of brigades with. So while they have dozens and hundreds of brigades on paper, none of those are going to have any form of armored support. They may have some shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, but they're not not even motorized, so they're not even that highly mobile. So in general, these forces only exist on paper. It doesn't matter if you say they're well equipped. If they don't even have an infantry fighting vehicle or transport trucks to move around with, they're not well equipped by modern standards. That's basically a stationary unit that is raised within a city, stays in that city. It cannot maneuver around the Russians. It cannot maneuver to attack the Russians. It basically is just raised in a stationary position, and it fights until it breaks, which is going to be pretty quickly because they're most likely going to get overwhelmed and they can't maneuver to get out of an encirclement, so they'll probably break pretty fast. And also on top of that, they have very little anti-air and anti-tank capabilities. So if the Russians send up a BMP, that might even be difficult for a unit like that to deal with. So I know that a lot of people want to say that the Finnish are well-equipped and well-armed, and the regular units are well-equipped and well-armed, but those are few in number. The reservists that would be called forward are basically cannon fodder for the larger part because they're not that well-equipped. But anyways, with that, we are going to be moving on from that and on into the rest of our news, which is actually going to be bringing us on into China, because we do have some very interesting developments coming out of China. We have been able to hear today that apparently Xi Jinping and the Russian Federation will be having a meeting on security issues. I wonder what kind of security issues the Russian Federation and the Chinese are going to be talking about. Makes you wonder.
I wonder.
But there they are, walking out of the jet, shaking hands. It's actually the foreign minister Wu Yang that the Russians are going to be talking to, but still, at the moment, they are going to be having some form of diplomatic negotiations of some sort. We believe that it might be asking, well, the Russians might be asking the Chinese to increase their dual-purpose support to the Russian Federation, which has become a staple for the Russians in the war effort, and that might be what the Russians are trying to ask for at the moment. Moving on out of that, though, it is time for us to get on into another interesting piece of news, which is generally going to be bringing us on over and into Ukraine, just for a brief moment before we hop over to the United States, so that way we can get to this poll really quickly, because we were able to hear that the Russian Federation has conducted airstrikes on Ukrainian civilians, and has started up airstrikes on Kyiv again tonight, which generally appears to be in violation of the U.S.-brokered winter truce, which is supposed to stop most Russian attacks on energy infrastructure, especially Kyiv's, for an entire week. And it appears that much as expected, has completely fallen through. And a lot of people are wondering, will the U.S. president actually recognize that blatant violation and respond to that accordingly, or will we ignore it and pretend like it didn't happen? And Matthew, what are people thinking about that, and what are you thinking about that as well?
All right, so we have seen that apparently Russia has already violated that energy ceasefire that was U.S. brokered. So will the U.S. respond about that situation? 62% said no, the U.S. will ignore it completely, while 16% said the USA will handle it quietly, and 15% said the U.S. will likely react strongly to the truce being broken. And I would say that unfortunately, with the way things have gone, I think the USA will try to handle this quietly. They'll probably issue some very quiet, like very mundane diplomatic statement about this. They probably won't completely ignore it because that would be a little bit wild, but they're not going to react strongly to it, certainly. They're going to pretend like this is just a misunderstanding because they don't seem to really be going very hard on Vladimir Putin. So it was expected that Russia was not going to adhere to the ceasefire, by the way. Nobody really expected that, and it's not shocking. But I'm with the 16%. And Enforcer, what say you?
I would have to say that I'm going to be with the 63%. It's highly likely that this is probably going to be outright ignored by the United States, and there won't even be a reaction to it at all, because we have seen that historically very similar ceasefires to this, when they're broken by the Russians, have been completely ignored to have been broken, and then the United States even alludes that the Ukrainians might have been the one to truly break them that brought the Russian wrath down on them. So I would say that I'd be with the majority of the 63%. It's highly likely the United States is just going to flat out ignore the attacks that have clearly violated the ceasefire. But moving on from that, we are going to be moving on over to the United States because we have some American news to get to. And we got to get to that American news. Inside the United States of America, we have big news, everyone. Real big news. The USS John F. Kennedy has gone out on sea trials today. Look at that. I mean, that is something else right there. I mean, look at this beauty.
Look at that go.
This is the second Gerald R. Ford class carrier in the entirety of the United States Navy. It's actually going to be the one taking the place of the USS Nimitz, which just came back from its last deployment about a month or two ago and is now going to be going through the process of being decommissioned. But the USS John F. Kennedy is going to be the one to replace the USS Nimitz. So pretty nice to see and good to hear. But moving on from that and on out of the area of Virginia, we are going to be moving on up into Washington, as we also were able to hear that there's apparently going to be a meeting at the Pentagon soon. We have heard that apparently the U.S. and the Israeli generals will be meeting on Friday at the Pentagon to discuss most likely the situation going on with Iran, which is showing at least some sort of joint discussion at this point about what they're going to be doing going on into the future. Additionally, we've also been able to hear that, according to the President of the United States, Cuba is going to be falling pretty soon. So I would have to say that's interesting, and we'll see how that goes. But anyways, moving on out of that and out of Washington, D.C., it is time for us to get on into Europe and all of the news that we have over here specifically. Now, we're going to be moving on into the war in Ukraine, which has a whole load of news coming out about it, and we're going to be making sure to get into all of that. There's a very interesting clip that actually has come out recently, folks, that we have never seen before, and this brings us back to hour 7 of the war in Ukraine. And it's hour 7 because this clip came out on the 23rd of February, 2022. That is almost 4 years ago to the day that this happened. And what we're going to be talking about is the Battle of Hostomel. The Battle of Hostomel was a historic battle and generally showed that the Ukrainians were going to be a lot more difficult to defeat than the Russians actually anticipated, because the Russian VDV forces that landed at Hostomel were pretty much wiped out before the main Russian column was even able to relieve them a day or two afterwards, after the VDV had landed here. The VDV had arrived into this battle on the back of Mi-17 and Ka-52 attack helicopters that flew over the area of the Sea of Kyiv, which is north of the Kyiv in this large reservoir here, and then flew into the Hostomel area, attacking the elements of the 4th Brigade that was holding this area, and then landed their VDV troops directly north and in these fields. The VDV then advanced down into the area of the main airport complex and the built-up areas, taking control of this area, with a smaller team also taking control of the northern perimeter of the airfield to try and make sure that they could land IL-76 transports to further extend their airhead and the control of the surrounding areas and fields of the airport to allow for further Russian forces to be flown in for the siege of Kyiv. The 4th Brigade then reorganized on the southern outskirts of the airport within the town of Hostomel later on in that day, and then with the elements of other Ukrainian brigades and basically battle groups that had been formed in ad hoc out of Kyiv, they then conducted a counterattack where they saw that they pushed the Russian Federation out of the southern end of the airfield pretty much within that same day, and then started to fight the Russians within this tree line here, while the Russian VDV elements within the northern part of the airfield had generally retreated to this point and had joined the Russians within the forest. Over that next day, we would see that entire VDV element in the woods would either be destroyed or broken, and would then go retreating northwards towards the Russian relief column and the town of Ozira, and by that time the main Russian armored column had arrived, and then pushed the Ukrainian 4th Brigade and the other elements of the Ukrainian forces back out of Hostomel and down through the Bucha, Hostomel, and Irpin area, where we then saw that the Ukrainians blew up the bridge crossing the Irpin River, seen right here. You can also see the replacement bridge that was set up there afterwards, because this bridge has still not had repairs effected completely, but they blew up this bridge and then basically defended this outskirt of Kyiv near the woods for as long as they could until the 1st of April, when the Russian Federation completely retreated and withdrew from this area. So, I had to remind you all of that whole battle to give you all the significance of the footage that we're about to see. This is the first footage we have ever seen, it took 4 years to get it, of the helicopters that actually flew over the Sea of Kyiv that day. So here's the clip.
Oh, wow.
We have never seen footage from the inside of these helicopters ever. Like, except for when they were landing at Hostomel and the VDV was hopping out of the helicopters, we never have seen footage in the entirety of the whole 4 years that we've covered this war of them flying over the Sea of Kyiv. So this is actually a first for video.
That's impressive, really, to see all those in a formation like that.
Yeah, it didn't end well for them. Like, it didn't end well for all these guys. Basically, everyone in these helicopters would end up dead by the next 2 days. So whoever filmed this video highly likely is dead at this point. And also, a couple of these helicopters...
They went out in a blaze of glory here, it looks like. A little blaze of glory is always a good way to go out.
Maybe. And also, this footage we actually did see, folks, from 4 years ago. This was one of the first clips we ever showed on this channel on 24-hour news coverage, was this clip right here of these Mi-17s and Ka-52s crossing over the Sea of Kyiv. And in this clip, we were able to confirm the loss of one Mi-17 by a man-pad. And here's the clip. Here it comes. I think they're going to slam that helicopter right there, if I remember right. Yep, it was that one.
Oh.
Yes!
Oh, man.
Yes, блядь! Два!
Oh, yes, блядь. All right.
Man, he was hype as hell. Like, man, he was excited.
And then the helicopter started firing flares out of that.
Man, and then they're like, oh yeah, we got these. And then they turn on the flare dispensers. They're like, well, you should have done that earlier. They didn't even know that there was going to be any air resistance. They thought they were literally flying into basically a piece of cake operation. Turns out, 4 years later, this war has now lasted longer than the Soviet Union fought the Germans in World War II. How things change. But it really brings you back to the old days, folks. Like, this was literally 4 years ago that this happened. It feels like yesterday, though, that I was on air. I was alone on air, and there were like 3 live viewers, and I was covering this while this was happening. 4 years ago. This was before Enforcer Matt even got on the channel that this happened, way back then. But this is the first time we ever got footage from the cockpit, so that was incredibly interesting. But we also were able to hear that the Russians are starting their attacks on Kyiv again, which appears to be, once again, generally violating the energy ceasefire that the president had apparently, quote-unquote, negotiated with the Russians just a couple of days ago. But moving us on and out into the location unknowns, we did have one interesting one today of this Russian absolutely eating it on an ATV. This one up here. Oh, he spins out. Oh!
Oh, no. Oh, man.
Yeah.
Man, he got the mud treatment. He got the mouthful.
Whoa, I mean, someone called this guy a pig because he's rolling in the mud. Whoa. Man, I'm not gonna lie. This guy's kind of been rough and tough, you know. Well, I mean, maybe that one fell flat, but you see him.
You're breaking up, by the way. Your Discord's having major issues tonight.
My Discord, I think it might be Discord itself because everything else is running fine, I think. Are y'all getting the stream good, folks? Has it been coming through clear? I hope it has. But oh, you see him trying to flip over the ATV, but it's smoking now. Ooh! Almost rolled back over on the guy. Oh, they laid on the horn.
Yeah, I think it's cooked. It's finished.
Well, that's the end of that clip, but that is something else right there, I'd have to say. Meanwhile, we also got the Russian casualty report for the past 24 hours, and holy moly!
Oh, they got a Bobcat. Let's go. Look at that. They got one Bobcat skid steer. You got to appreciate it, too. But tell us more.
Would you look at that? And really quickly, I got to see if I can find Miss Decent Keeper of the Record summary because it wasn't showing up at the top. Where in the world is it? It's not showing up. So unfortunately, we don't have Miss Decent Keeper of the Record's record summary today. Sadly, for some reason, it's not showing up in the comments over here. But we did see that over the past 24 hours, 1,090 Russian soldiers were wounded and killed in the past 24 hours, along with 3 APCs, 62 supply trucks, 6 main battle tanks, 9 artillery pieces, 206 UAVs, and 1 Bobcat skid steer. And also, apparently, they finally did listen to Miss Decent Keeper of the Records. They finally adjusted the submarine losses back to 2, because 2 submarines have been lost at this point in the war. Look at that. Isn't that wonderful? That's a great thing, actually. And it's good to see that they are continuing to take significant losses inside of Ukraine. Moving on from that and on up into the northern front, the Ukrainians are still waging a heavy battle at this point for the city of Kupiansk. Kupiansk is a fairly important city within the northern flank, as it is basically a crossroads of the region, and also crossing the very arduous Oskol River, which has actually proven to be a pretty significant logistical obstacle for the Russians through most of the war. The Ukrainians were able to retake this city and also push the Russians back east of Kucherivka, which is generally a non-existent village, and currently the battles are still being fought around the area of Petropavlivka right now. There are some very small pockets of Russian armed forces that are stuck around this area of the central part of the city of Kupiansk, and it does appear that the Ukrainians have continued to smack them around a little, give them a hitting. Oh,
We'll drop it.
Oh, there it goes. Man,
There
what the
you
hell
go.
was that? The Despicable Me bomb? I'm not gonna lie, the Ukrainians kind of built this one interesting. That looks like a trash can with like a Bunsen burner attached to it, kind of.
Honestly, it kind of does. Also, by the way, just to call this off, we are about $300 away from hitting the goal, by the way. We hadn't called it off in a second, but we are super close to hitting the goal. Sean Willem just pointed that out, and I just wanted to say that. We're at $2,200 raised, and the goal is $2,500, so getting pretty close.
I'd have to say that it is very close, and it sounds as though, folks, we're about to be screaming goal here in a little bit. It sounds like we're getting very close to that fundraiser goal. But we got to see the bomblet dropped. I wonder what kind of explosive force this Despicable Me bomb is going to have. Oh! Like let out an orange smoke. That's interesting. And off they go. Off they go into the distance. But that's the end of that clip. And also, at the end here, we got to see a little bit more of that surrounding area. And I wonder, folks, is it this area right here? Or is it this area up here? I'm trying to see where I can find this for y'all, because this is in the central area of Kupiansk. But I wasn't able to geolocate. Oh? What the? It's right here, apparently. It's this spot right here.
Look at that. It's right there. You found it.
Right there, next to the railroad station. Holy moly, it's always about railroads, everyone. And Jim L just threw in 195.
Holy moly. Damn, son. We're about 60 or 70 bucks away from hitting the goal right this second.
Whoop to you, Matt. It's special for your support. And I got to say, we're getting very close, everyone, to the fundraiser goal. Holy moly, Red Russell just threw in 20. A 20, bleed. We are getting very close to fundraiser goal. Very, very close. As a matter of fact, we're getting so close that since Matthew brought up Discord issues, I will help him by liberating him from the Discord. Give me just a second. Oh, hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, hello there. That fixed it right up. But we are getting close. We're getting close, Matthew. Any minute now. Any minute. Oh, we had the goal!
We had the goal! Chugga, Eagle! Let's go! Hey! Let's go!
Let's go, baby! And we just got another 100 from an anonymous. We just hit the goal.
Man, we are well above the goal. Now that 100 Canadians anonymous right there. Look at Squeaky Geek throwing in a 20. Look at Rob's throwing in a 5. Look at this. We're now well above the goal. Now we're about 100 and something bucks above it right this second.
I gotta say, folks, it's truly amazing and impressive to see that we've hit another fundraiser goal. We are now well above $2,500, and we are well on our way to victory. And I gotta say, it's always a wonderful thing. It's a beautiful thing to see. And I gotta thank y'all all once again for supporting that fundraiser massively, because Nova Ukraine does incredible work overseas in Ukraine, helping to save lives. So a humongous thanks to every single one of y'all so much once again. And with that, it's now time for us to move on from the Kupiansk front, now that we have Enforcer Matt here with us in full Technicolor. And it's time for us to move on down into Konstantinivka. The Konstantinivka front is largely static at this moment. The Russian Federation is still trying to break through Chasiv Yar and the outskirts of Toretsk to directly threaten the town of Konstantinivka with infantry assaults, but at the moment it does not appear that they'll be doing that anytime soon. The Russians are advancing about 10 meters a day, that's 30 feet in Chasiv Yar, meaning that in about 100 days they'll have advanced, let me make sure that I'm going to get this right. In about 100 days, they'll have advanced about 3,000 feet. That means that in about 3 months, they'll maybe have advanced another half mile or so. So they're not making it that far in Chasiv Yar right now. And also in Touretsk, they're basically making it nowhere. We did get to see that some Russian ambush drones in the meantime that are trying to inflict losses on the Ukrainian armed forces within this area were hit and destroyed by the Ukrainian National Police. Because the police don't play around in Ukraine, folks. the police are probably some of the hardest fighters that we have seen in the Konstantinivka front, especially in the Battle of Toretsk. They were going through clearing buildings like it was nobody's business. They were almost like the special forces with how they were doing it. But we can see the national police here taking care of these idling drones. Man, we got someone coming in here with the freaky out emojis.
Look at that. The bots have been here strong tonight. I don't know what's up with that.
Man, it's that we trending again. Like, it really is. Oh, there was a Russian kamikaze drone right there, and another one. I mean, the Ukrainians are cooking these things up, and they actually do cause a significant risk to Ukrainian rear-line actions, like in Konstantinivka, and that's why the Ukrainians put a high priority on targeting these and destroying them if they can find them. But they are putting in some work, putting in the hours, and taking what's ours. I mean, holy moly. They're obliterating a load of these. It's actually crazy how many drones the Russians use these days.
They're really putting the hurt on them.
Whoa, I mean, I don't want to call them Meal Team 6, but look at that boiler. Whoa.
Also, by the way, Chef Danny B throwing in an extra 50 right there. We've had some pretty good amount of top donors since the last time we called them out, too. So we'll get around to calling off our top donors. They're currently sitting at $2,700 raised right now.
Oh, man, that's pretty impressive right there. And moving on from that, and on up into the area of the Dobropilia front, we also get to see the 93rd Brigade, the famous fighting 93rd, taking down some drones as well. Look at that one. They turned that one into Lego pieces right here. It came flying at high speed and kind of just shattered to pieces on the road. They also took that one down as it was trying to get to their APC. This Ukrainian literally ducked and rolled, and then the Ukrainians got to taking out some Russians here in these clips. Take a look at this. Putting in the work. Drones actually account, folks, crazily enough, for 70% of all Russian casualties at this point in the war. Drones have quite literally replaced the role of artillery historically, as artillery was usually what accounted for the wide majority of battlefield casualties. Now it's actually FPV drones. Y'all are seeing what is basically a new age of warfare every time we look at the war in Ukraine, because the fact that it has supplanted artillery for the amount of losses in war is something that has quite truly never been heard of. Artillery in every conventional war has always accounted for around 70% of all frontline casualties, actually all war casualties. Now it only accounts for, I believe it's something like 7%, and the drones account for about 70-something% now, so it's unbelievably skewed in favor of the drones being the next form of indirect fire support.
It is impressive, really.
It really is something. I got to say, all these bots coming in with the tongues, I mean, they freaky they're going, ah! Like, man, I don't know what's up with that. That's crazy.
They got the bot farms back in action, apparently. It looks like the whole kit and caboodle's active.
Man, I'd say. Well, one interesting clip, I'd have to say. I mean, they definitely are slamming the Russians there. That's for sure. But moving on from that clip from the 93rd Brigade, we are going to be moving on and into the area of the town of Bilitske, which is actually a small town that the Ukrainians have been holding on the northern flank of the Pokrovsk battlefield that is one of the major battlefields, generally, that the Russians are trying to break through to make it to the larger town of Dobropilia to the northwest. At the moment, the Ukrainians have been holding the town for some time, and we have been able to see that they filmed the town today, showing the damage that had been caused by the Russian artillery and shelling that had been going on for months at this point, as it has been a major point of contention on the northern flank. We see
the pure devastation out here. This whole town's been ravaged.
It really has been. But it once again is a silver lining in a sense that the town is so heavily damaged. It's been showing that the Ukrainians have held this position for an incredibly long amount of time for it to be this damaged. We also were able to see further south in the battlefield of Pokrovsk itself that while the Russian Federation is in the town, they are making very modest, if not non-existent advances most days, with the Ukrainians stopping most of every advance throughout the past few months. The Russian Federation has currently found itself stuck right now in the rail yards within the central area of the city, as their front expands literally along the rail line through the area. The Russians are attempting to try and break through this area and get into the northern part of Kupiansk, but have generally run into some major issues with that because this rail yard largely exists as a flat open field dividing the city for all tactical purposes. So they have to try and make the run over over 100 yards or so in the wide open across the rail yard to get to the other side, to the railway station, and also the other residential areas beyond that. That's posed a humongous issue, and the Ukrainians have generally been able to stop most Russian attack teams that have tried to make basically the guaranteed death run across the rail yards. So this means that the Ukrainians have been able to hold on to the northern part of Pokrovsk and also secure their supply line to Mirnohrad for an incredibly long time, and Ukrainian forces in both Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk are still holding their positions and generally holding some parts of the city, ensuring that the Russians are not able to end these battles and start moving even further west and towards the border of Donetsk. Since the Ukrainians are continuing these actions, we've also seen that the Ukrainians have been conducting airstrikes in the Russian rear lines near to the town of Seladove. Any second now. Any second now, believe it. Ooh!
Oh, man. Look at that. Look at that.
And we see them hitting it again. Damn! Man, I told you, something crazy right there.
That's a building blowing up.
Man, I'd have to say. Meanwhile, we also were able to see within the area close inside of Pokrovsk, the 68th Jaegers were also using their drone forces to target and destroy Russians that had made it into the city. So here is that clip as well. Oh, is that a Desert Cross? Well, I guess you could say it was Desert Crossed. Oh, man, now they're about to go for
it. It was a Desert Cross. It was one until it got, hit.
Oh, and now
look at that guy running for his life.
Ooh, they got that Bohanka, I tell you. Ooh, and they also got that little ATV. And how about this little Desert Cross right here? Oh, they tried the bob and weave, but bobbing and weaving don't really help. They also got this tank. Unfortunately, I can't tell you what variant it is, but it did have a mine plow on the front of it, and it appears that they got that as well. The 68th Jaegers, they're doing work. Rah! Anyways, moving on from the Pokrovsk front, we also were able to see within the southern area, the Russian Federation did target coal mines today within the area of Vasilkivka in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast in this clip right here.
Oh.
Pretty significant explosions. We also had a secondary clip of that right here as well.
The famous car alarm. You gotta love it.
Very unfortunate to see that the Russians are continuing to attack generally civilian infrastructure like coal mines, because to be entirely frank with y'all, coal really doesn't serve that much of an important purpose in modern wars beyond the production of steel. But if you really wanted to target something that would be directly correlated to the war effort, it actually would be a coke plant, because you actually have to bake the coal and bake off the coal gases to be able to create coke, which is then used in the steel making process. So targeting a coke plant could be considered a war target, but targeting a coal mine outright is not a war target at all. It would be very hard to make that justification. So generally, the Russians are still conducting war crimes against the civilian populace however they can throughout the country. Meanwhile, within the southern area in Zaporizhia, we also saw that the Ukrainians targeted and destroyed the incredibly exceptional Buk. We always like to say that the Ukrainians rebuke the Buk, and they're about to rebuke this one here. Kaboosh! And they got it. It's gone. 15 million down the drain, just like that.
Just like that. Money gone. Money lost, so they'll never get back.
Man, little skull emoji down there going, I'm weak! Man, but anyways, that's the end of that clip. Pretty nice to see. And moving on from that and on down towards the area of Balohi, we also were able to see the 65th Mechanized Brigade targeting and hitting Russian artillery. We see them coming on in and hitting the Russian artillery piece. And we can also see them hitting this next one here as well. You can also see them lining up and targeting this little support vehicle for the artillery. We can also see them flying down the front and trying to target this Russian soldier who has just abandoned this vehicle right here. What is that? Oh, that looked like a Toyota. Well, it's not no longer a Toyota. It's now what we call scrap value. We also saw this Russian Ural here that apparently got stuck. That's actually kind of rare, honestly. A Ural of all things.
A Russian Ural.
Bleh. Well, you can see. Also, Urtat's coal mines during wartime in most countries considered government or military property. I've never heard of that. I've never heard of the coal mines being federalized in the United States, except for in one instance where it was threatened by Teddy Roosevelt in 1903 during the coal strikes, where Teddy Roosevelt threatened to federalize the mines and have them operated by the U.S. military in the meantime until the strikes were concluded with some form of a negotiation. But I've never heard of a country, at least in the United States, from what I would know, nationalizing coal mines. Because I wouldn't really know how that would work, especially in a U.S. legal framework, because then the governments would basically be leasing the mines for some time, like they did when they nationalized the railroads. So I would have to say, I would have to look into that a little bit. I don't think that's necessarily the case, and I know that with the Ukrainian mines, they're still operated by independent mine contractors and operators that own and operate those mines. We know that because there was a documentary that the Ukrainians put out about a coal mine that was about 17 miles from the front, and it was still being operated by an independent company and not by a nationalized organization being run by the government of Ukraine. So with that, we will be moving on further on down. I will look into that, though. You might actually be right, but I think in America that would not necessarily be the case, and that's what I'm generally working off of as my base of knowledge here. But anyways, we did get to see that near to the area of the Novoyakovlivka front in the southern flank, the Ukrainians really gave one to the Russians. Take a look. And look, 4 Russian prisoners, would you look at that right there, really something. And of course, it is good to see that the Russian Federation is continuing to take losses, generally in every single direction, in every single front, and in every single place of the front lines. The Ukrainians are making sure that they're not advancing an inch. And if you say, oh, that's unfortunate, all those Russians being lost, well, they wouldn't be getting lost if they weren't trying to advance deeper into Ukraine. So that's basically the run-of-the-mill sort of a situation that we've been dealing with for 1,440 days. If the Russians don't like dying in the front lines in Ukraine, then they ought to go home. And that's really the answer. But anyways, with that, it is time for us to move on up into Kyiv, and time for us to get on into the speech from the president of Ukraine, the speech from the president Volodymyr Zelensky. And so, folks, without further ado, here is the speech. Speech!
Бажаю здоров'я. Щойно провів селектор по ситуації в усіх наших регіонах. Дніпровщина. У Тернівці Павлоградського району був удар російських дронів по звичайному автобусу. Автобус із шахтарями, на жаль, багато загиблих. Мої співчуття всім рідним та близьким. Також є поранені. Міста Нікополь, Марганець були з відключеннями електрики через удари дронів по енергетичним лініям. Були удари і по логістиці, по залізниці на Дніпровщині, на Сумщині, в Конотопі. Сьогодні теж росіяни били по інфраструктурі залізниці. Залізничники реагують, відновлюють, стараються дуже швидко все лагодити і зберігають зв'язок між регіонами. Була доповідь щодо Київської області. Фактично щодня в області додається когенерація. Це дуже важливо. Дякую. Видаються теплові набори для людей. Ми будемо збільшувати цю програму. Щодня на Київщині роздають близько 5 тисяч таких наборів. Хочу подякувати Нафтогазу за підтримку цієї програми. Продовжується надзвичайно складна ситуація в Києві з теплом. Більше ніж 500 багатоквартирних будинків без опалення. Досі ремонтні роботи. Це точно не може сприйматися як щось нормальне в місті, коли вже далеко не перший тиждень кількість будинків без тепла. Кожен день, незалежно від ситуації, сотні будинків. Є удари, немає ударів, все одно сотні будинків в Києві без опалення. Це означає, що роботи в місті недостатньо. Була доповідь МВС України по пунктах підтримки та обігріву у Києві. Більше людей зараз звертається і в кількох районах розгорнуті додаткові пункти. Надається гаряче харчування усім, хто потребує такої підтримки. Допомога буде надана. Лінія 112 працює, щоб фіксувати всі потреби. Є урядовий контактний центр. Місто, хоча в цьому повинно працювати з урядовими структурами швидше. дуже цього прошу, щоб люди могли отримувати вчасно допомогу і реальну інформацію. Були також доповіді по ситуації на Харківщині, ситуації в Черкащині, в Хмельницькій області, в Чернівецькій області. Окремо ми обговорювали з міністром енергетики щодо взаємодії з Румунією. Були доповіді по Донеччині. Важливо, що на кожну потребу служби реагують, і дякую за це. Одеса, область, триває відновлення після негоди, всі необхідні сили залучені. Є відключення на Кіровоградщині. Роботи там ведуться. Були звіти і по Вінницькій області, Житомирській, також Полтавщині, по Миколаєвої області, Чернігівщина, Херсонщина, наше Запоріжжя та область. Багато обстрілів. На кожен з них має бути відповідь як військова, так і дипломатична. Перше залежить від наших воїнів, але друге більше від партнерів. Була доповідь нашої переговорної команди. Вже є домовленість про зустріч тристоронньої. Зустріч на належному рівні. Буде ця зустріч наступного тижня, як плануємо, в середу і четвер. В Еміратах, як і минулого разу. Щойно я говорив з Рустемом Умєровим. На завтра я призначив нараду, щоб погодити рамки розмови і підготувати все. В понеділок ввечері команда вже буде в дорозі на перемовини. Багато лідерів, різні країни з нами в цьому процесі підтримують Україну. І фактично щодня ми координуємось. В лютому буде достатньо серйозна наша зовнішня політична активність. І вже із завтрашнього дня контакти та зустрічі. Розраховуємо, що і американська сторона буде так само активна. І, зокрема, це стосується заходів деескалації, скорочення ударів. Багато залежить від того, що вдасться американській стороні, щоб люди довіряли і процесу, і результатам, безумовно. Сьогоднішній російський удар по автобусу на Дніпровщині – це злочин показовий, який ще раз демонструє, що саме Росія несе відповідальність за ескалацію. Зло повинно зупинитись. Дякую кожному в світі, хто з Україною. Слава Україні!
Dang, you just
Your
said
slava.
quick and your long slava. But man, he sat there and said, "We're going to do this rum slava." I was like, "Damn, okay." But beyond that, it is time for us folks to get on into the second segment of the stream, where we get to talk to each and every one of y'all. And holy moly, folks, what a night it's been! We have been able to raise more than $2,500 for this fundraiser. I think we're up to close to $3,000, Matthew. Is that right?
We are over $3,000. We're at $3,046 raised right this second, which is fantastic to see. We are now officially $546 above the goal as of right now.
Dang, that is absolutely crazy, folks. Sadly, I actually cannot see the fundraiser because my second screen is a little finicky, and it likes to turn off when it gets a little bit too busy. It's kind of getting lazy these days. I'm thinking about threatening to fire it so that way it'll get its ass in gear, but then it might unionize with the other monitor, and then that might be a whole issue. But outside of that, though, I do have to say that it is absolutely crazy to hear that we have raised over $3,000 for Novoukraini. And Matthew, do we have any top donors that we can shout out here in this little segment before we get on into all the questions?
So we have a heap of top donors to cover, and to give them their credit, we have had a 333 come in from Hal Rose, one of the biggest ones since the last time we called them off. Also, we had a 195 from Jim L, as well as a 100 from Patrick Chapter Lane, as well as a 50 from South Carolina Deer Girl, as well as a 50 from Dixie LaFleur, as well as Greg Carrier, Truckin' Chef, and Chef Danny B. And a huge shout out to all those top donors, by the way, once again, for making that goal happen tonight. And also, like we said before, a huge shout out to literally anybody that threw in any support tonight, because that did add up, as you can see, to have another successful Sunday night fundraiser. And Enforcer, what say you?
I gotta say a huge shout out to everyone, both the massive donors and the smaller donors, who have been able to fundraise for this fundraiser tonight for Nova Ukraine. Y'all have done an absolutely amazing amount of effort and a great deal of help, and we are massively appreciative to all of y'all, because y'all support goes directly to Nova Ukraine, which helps out massively in Ukraine to save lives of the very people that we cover the news on every single day. So a humongous thanks to all of y'all so much once again. I hope that does address that incredibly well. And with that, folks, it's time for us to start moving on into our questions at large. And we can talk about literally anything and everything, except for religion, politics, climate change, or whether the A-10 Warthog is relevant in modern warfare. And no, we're not going to be having anyone in this question segment because we've had so many bots tonight say TDS or Democrats. Those two statements will get you automatically banned. I've seen that like maybe over 100 times tonight from bots and the like. And those are some of the stupidest terms I've ever heard. Like, the terms that people come up with in politics these days, folks, are like the stuff that sixth graders would come up with. And he doesn't like my guy. He's mentally ill. Or, they're demons. It's like, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, like, from both groups. So, any statements of that is a direct ban instantly. There's no second guessing or warnings on that one, because, I mean, that is pretty dumb. But anyways, with that, it is time for us to get on to the questions. Matthew, what do we got?
All right, so jumping into our question segment, tonight, of course, it is a Sunday night fundraiser stream, so instead of getting a lot of super chats, we have a lot of live chat questions from the audience tonight. But first of all, jumping into our Morse code decoders, we had Paul Schultz, Kevin J, Mason Miami, Joni Dog, Norm Pritchett, Arabelle Garbo, Royal Fluffiness, Coach Cover Terry Sire, and Brian Blairstown, and they said, the Morse says, Iran's pretending like they might negotiate to buy themselves some more time, and LLT, LSA.
And that's the sound of money, and y'all got that dead on the nail. That is the Morse code message of the night. And I gotta say, a humongous congratulations to everyone in the Lee Spring Army Stone Corps that's been getting that all correct all the time for 1,440 days. Truly something crazy to think about right there. And you know, something that's even crazier to think about, folks, is that in 22 days at this point, 22 days from now, we're going to be moving into the 5th year of news coverage on the channel, because we'll now be rounding out our 4th year. That's kind of crazy. That's kind of crazy when you think about it. And I got to say that that's really crazy to think that we'll be doing that. It's even crazier to think, folks, that the 5th anniversary of the LSA's founding will be next year in February. Like, well, actually, I believe it's in March. I'll have to make sure to check. And we're going to be getting some big stuff set up, because I was thinking about that in my head. I was like, wait a minute, is this the 5th anniversary? I was like, no, because the LSA was founded in 2022. So that means that while we're entering the 5th year of coverage, we're not going to be entering the 5th anniversary of the founding of the LSA until next year in 2027. So we are going to be trying to get some stuff set up for the 5th anniversary of the LSA. It'll probably be like a years-long celebration. Like maybe some extra stuff, neat things in the intro and whatnot, because that's going to be a pretty crazy year. 5 years of the Lee Spring Army. But something else to think that we've been around for this long running the show, and I've got to thank everyone who's been here this long, deciphering the Morse code message, listening to the news, supporting the fundraisers, supporting the channel through super chats, Patreon memberships, and everything and the like, and everyone who's just been a humongous part of the LSA. We've got to thank each and every one of y'all, because we have come around to basically covering the news for a whole other year again. And I never thought that we would surpass 1,000 days of news coverage, much less getting close to about 1,500 days of straight endless news coverage of everything that's been going on around the world. And so with that, I hope that does address that the best that we can, and I hope that lets you all know that we're greatly appreciative of y'all being here for years at this point. And with that, Matthew, what questions do we have?
All right, so we do have actually 2 super chats to address in the meantime, and our first one goes to none other than Mark-Andre Burnett, who put in a $6 donation, a super chat that is, and thank you very much, Mark, for that super chat, even on a Sunday. And he said, you guys are the best. The LSA community will never truly die, and thanks to everyone who donated to the fundraiser.
Hey, and thank you so much for the incredibly kind words and the support on a Sunday. Now, that's something else. Support on a Sunday. And I got to thank you massively for the support and helping this channel to keep running. And I got to say, long live the Lee Spring Army, and the Lee Spring Army will never die. And the LSA is truly an amazing group of folks. An incredible group of folks when you really think about it. I mean, they come from every corner of the globe, but they all agree in one thing: American and Western interests. And that is a great thing to know, that so many people continue to support and rally around the old flag that keeps the Western world going pretty much every single day. And so with that, a humongous thanks to you so much once again. I hope that does address that incredibly well. And also, folks, you know something else that's crazy? Man, I'm about to blow your mind. We have had, let me think here. We captured Maduro. Let me just look at all of our stream headlines here, old boy, and let me see what in the world's happened just in this 1 month. So, let's see. We had the whole Iran uprising, the Iran massacre. Maduro was captured. Multiple Russian oil tankers were seized. The Russians fired an IRBM Ukraine. The Russian oil rigs were blown up in the Caspian Sea. Some tankers were attacked and destroyed. U.S. carriers deployed to the Middle East. The second Syrian civil war happened and basically ended in January. Let's see here. Oh yeah, a couple of major Russian ports were blown up and destroyed this month. And then the U.S. started to build up forces inside of the Middle East to prepare for strikes on Iran. The Chinese purged their Central Military Commission, which is basically their version of the Pentagon. And then we're basically getting ready for a war with Iran at this point. And all of that happened, folks, in just January. So imagine everything that's going to be happening for the rest of this year.
Man, that's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, that is a lot of stuff going on. But anyways, with that, we're on to the next one.
And our next one here goes to Dark Galaxy, puts in the 5. And thank you very much, good sir, as well, for that support, that super chat. He said, if China and Russia try to help Iran, do you think the U.S. and the United Nations will get pulled into a third world war?
Can you reread that one again?
I said, if China and Russia try to help Iran, do you think the U.S. and the United Nations will get pulled into a third world war?
Generally, the United Nations wouldn't get pulled into it, neither would NATO, but it definitely would be a world war. But the problem is that the Russians and the Chinese really can't directly support the Iranians, so in hypothetical terms, it would turn into a world war, but in general, it most likely wouldn't, because they probably wouldn't be able to help out anyways. And they both made it incredibly clear that they're not going to be helping out, so that's kind of the funny part about it. But with that, I hope that does address that well, and with that, we're on to the next one.
All right, and moving into our live chat questions, our first live chat is going to go to none other than Old Warrior. And Old Warrior put in a good live chat question. He said, did you see the Russian attempt at a cavalry charge today?
I don't think we did, because I actually had to cut down a lot of our Ukraine war footage because there was a lot of it that came out today. So I had to cut it down to basically the bare minimum. And I think that might have been the other day, because if it was the 2 Russian cavalrymen that got dismounted and then they got hit by the drone, we actually covered that, I think, the other day. But I didn't see one of those happen today myself personally. But with that, I hope that does address that the best that I can. And with that, we're on to the next one.
And our next question goes to Erling Gruel, who said, is there any truth to the fact or the allegation that U.S. servicemen have been killed today in Iraq?
I didn't get to confirm that myself personally, and we did not hear of any announcements of that. So we believe that that might be false information, because I didn't see anything cross our radar, either Matthew or mine, because we repost everything that we both see on Twitter about U.S. soldiers being killed in Iraq today. So I'd have to say that that probably was possibly a fake story that was put out that you may have heard about. But Matthew, do you have any information on that?
I haven't heard anything about that personally. We haven't even gotten official confirmation that U.S. forces are actually in Iraq. We have seen the footage appearing to show them in northern Iraq, but rather than that, we haven't really heard much of anything about U.S. forces in that area.
Yeah, I haven't really heard much about that either. But anyways, with that, we are on to the next one.
And our next one goes to Marie Jacobs, who said, is there any truth that the Iranians are still executing people in public?
From what we know, it's most likely true. We haven't seen any video or picture evidence of that, but we do see an endless stream of body bags entering Tehran for some form of disposal, usually on the daily basis at the moment. So we do believe that there are executions happening in the general provinces of Iran, and the bodies are being transported to Tehran for some form of disposal, highly likely some form of cremation. So I hope that does address that the best I can, at least from what we would know at the moment. But unfortunately, we don't really have any direct picture evidence to confirm the executions to say clearly that that's happening, but just due to the high volume of body bags that continue to arrive in Tehran, we can generally assume that that is the case. And so with that, I hope that does address that the best that we possibly can. And with that, we are on to the next one.
And we also have one from TS Actual, who said, what would regime or government collapse in Cuba look like, and will become lawless like Haiti?
That's a good question. And the answer to will it become lawless like Haiti is generally no, because Haiti is a very special sort of an exception to the reason why it became lawless. Because and what's interesting about Haiti is that Haiti is actually a part of La Española, which is the island that the Dominican Republic and Haiti are on. But Haiti was actually a French colony, and this actually gets into a little bit of a darker part of history, as many people would know. But Haiti was a French colony and used extreme cruelty on its slave populations, and the slaves outnumbered the actual French by massive margins. 90% of the population of Haiti was slaves, while 10% of it was actually the French planters. So in the 1790s, around the time of the French Revolution, a slave revolt happened in Haiti to where all of the slaves revolted against their overlords, which were only 10% of the population, and killed every single one of them. Men, women, and children were not spared. Every single French settler in Haiti was killed by the slaves. But right after that happened, there was basically no external foreign support to Haiti from any country, either the new French Republic, the United States, or anyone else. Basically meaning that they had no one to trade with. So their hardly existent economy, which existed entirely on tobacco and sugar, which was basically the staple of Cuba and La Española, completely collapsed, meaning that they went from the French colonists having some money to nobody had money, and also the French colonists were dead. So their economic situation has been absolutely deplorable from that point on, and because of the wildly despotic economic conditions, we then saw that right after that, in the early 1800s, the Haitian government began to splinter already back then, and basically throughout the rest of history, it's been a wildly unstable government because the country is heavily factionalized, because people join these different factions that will go to any lengths to be able to try and get basic resources to survive, to try and keep their one group alive, which has basically made it to where Haiti has always been unstable. That's very different than Cuba, because if Cuba's government collapses, unlike the very exceptional situation that led to Haiti being Haiti, Cuba would not turn into Haiti, because Cuba would most likely get some form of foreign support directly, most likely by the United States if their government collapses and is replaced with a pro-American one. So they will most likely start to develop a very heavy tourism industry, which is a very big moneymaker for the Dominican Republic, which actually has one of the highest GDP per capitas in the Americas outside of the United States currently because of its tourism industry. And they also might start to lean back into their sugar and tobacco exports, although it would primarily be mostly only tobacco, especially if the United States is their only major trade partner, because we still have a existing tariff on sugar from foreign countries that particularly pertains to Cuban sugar, because they were undercutting sugar growers here in America. So it probably would be a heavy tourism and tobacco-based economy in terms of exports. And that would generally get them in a pretty stable sort of an economic position, one where they would be on the up and up, more so than basically stuck at a dead end like Haiti has been ever since the revolt back in the 1790s. So with that, I hope that does address that the best I can, at least from what I would know. And you know, something that's really interesting is that the Dominican Republic actually does have a very decent standard of living compared to most other Caribbean islands. Most Caribbean islands are actually pretty... Some of them are fairly wealthy, but some of them are, of course, exceptions, like the Cayman Islands, for example. But the Dominican Republic actually has a very decent standard of living. Their GDP per capita is actually a little bit better than Mexico's. And also their median income is a little bit better than Mexico's. Mexico is a very prosperous country these days, next to the United States and Canada, at least in their economic quality of life. And what's interesting about that is because the Dominican Republic leaned heavily into tourism. They're almost a monolithic economy on tourism. But since the tourism dollars pretty much never really die, they ended up getting a pretty decent looking country out of the whole deal. It's littered with nothing but high-end resorts. Generally it has beautiful jungle and tropical scenery behind the resorts, off of the beaches. Overall, it's not a bad place. But if you go right next door, right across the border into Haiti, Haiti is pretty much the equivalent of a hellhole. Like, there's really no other way to explain it. They have no economy. They basically trade with no one because they have nothing to trade. So they can never pull themselves out of the rut. No one's really ever willing to provide them support, because the support basically goes into a black hole, because the heavily, I guess you could say, factionalized existence of Haiti doesn't really support any sort of stability that would lead to continued economic growth. So they're pretty much stuck in an endless cyclical cycle of living in a basic hell. So a little bit interesting. It's a complete opposite of what the Dominican Republic is. The Dominican Republic is one of the most successful countries in the Americas, at least in terms of the quality of life their people have, and Haiti is literally the worst country in the Americas for the quality of life, and they're both on the same island. It's kind of like North and South Korea, but for the Americas. But anyways, with that, we are on and into the next one.
All right, so our next one here goes to TS Actual yet again. He said, if SF aircraft are both in Azerbaijan and Diego Garcia, will we see Iran hit from multiple different angles?
I'm thinking that it's possible. That's actually what I was talking about earlier on the limited ground operation side of things, is that it may be possible that we're planning on multiple special operations raids in different areas of the country to conduct different sorts of missions on the ground to further weaken the Iranians over a long-term air campaign. And that's actually what I'm thinking at the point, because you wouldn't have that many MC-130Js, which are specialized for Special Operations Command use, in the area to call forward into CENTCOM's war plans against Iran, unless if you were planning on using them. Because a lot of people were saying back in the day that the 160th the Special Operations Aviation Regiment of the Army that was spotted at Trinidad and Tobago was probably just there to distract the Venezuelans, and funnily enough, it ended up being used as one of the only ground forces that went in and grabbed Maduro. So I would say that it's decently likely that these are being pulled in, because there are some forms of special operations that are being planned by CENTCOM at the moment, and they're bringing these in so that way, if it's conducted, they will be able to pull it off. So with that, I hope that does address that the best I can. And with that, we are on and into the next one.
All right, and our next live chat question goes to one visual who said, "Do you think it's simple?" Let's see here. I think there's a typo. He said, "Do you think that it's simply impossible to defeat a country with land invasions due to geographical issues?"
I don't think it's entirely impossible, but it does make a situation a lot more difficult and resource intensive. Because you can generally get over terrain with enough willpower and enough resources and enough funding. But generally, if we're wanting to conduct a light operation in Iran that doesn't see high casualties, because casualties are very unpopular with the American public, although they sometimes might be necessary. Like, speaking in a strategic sense, I'm not one to just go and throw people into the meat grinder, but in a strategic sense, sometimes casualties are necessary to achieve an objective, but it's highly unpopular to see casualties. No one really wants to see casualties, so for that reason, conducting a war in Iran while sustaining very little casualties on the ground would be very tough because of their geography, without heavy amounts of funding and huge amounts of forces in the area. And that's why I'm saying that with Iran, it probably won't be likely that we see any of those sorts of operations taking place, because it's decently likely that we wouldn't want to sustain any form of casualties. So with that, I hope that does address it the best I can, at least in my opinion. And with that, we are on and into the next one.
All right, and we also have a question from Avari Mandabrados. He said, "Where does the USN think Iran's hidden swarm boats are being based, and how effective do you think U.S. bunker busters would be against hardened boat tunnels near the coast if they can be found?"
Generally, a lot of those boats are actually kept, from what we know, mostly in the wide open somewhere. I don't know exactly where they are, but tunnels are generally non-existent because there aren't any rocky cliffs along the Iranian coasts. Most of it is just a gradual drop-off into the beach or into the shore area, so there really isn't a way to make tunnels in any large number, and they'd also be easily seen by satellite and would be known of. So I think that most of those are just based out of a place like Bandar Abbas, and we might be able to look around and find them here really quickly. We can see some barges. We can also see, oh look, there's that crappy little stealth boat thing that they tried to make right there.
Yeah, it's the Batman. It's the
Batmobile. Oh look, here's the speedboats. They're right here. They just have them up on the concrete on like trailers.
Man, it's janky as hell looking too. It looks like a junkyard.
Yeah, it really does. So I guess what they do, folks, is that they just back these trailers down this boat ramp over here, literally like they're going fishing, and then they just slide them off into the water. So there is no tunnels. They literally just have them sitting out like fishing boats. So you can just hit these with a normal bomb, and they're done for. You can also hit that crappy little Batmobile thing with a bomb, and that thing will be done for as well. I think we might be able to find more of these around here if we look around. There's a couple more of them here. Like, there's a few of them. And then here's some more of them right down here. Another Batmobile boat, of a different design, actually. It's slightly different design, but somewhat similar. Two more little minesweepers, basically. And let's see, what else do we have around this port area? Some fishing boats. This might be where some of the more, like, little speedboats are held, or penned up at least. I don't see any speedboats around here. A lot of cars, though. A lot of parking spaces. And let's see. Oh, here's more of the speedboats. So, I mean, you can literally just hit these with normal bombs. And, I mean, as far as getting these into the water, this would probably take some time. Because they would have to load up each of these onto a truck and then have that truck back into the water with the trailer attached and then push the boat off and then everyone get on the boat and then send it off on its way. And doing that for dozens of these would take a decent amount of time. So they would have to be pre-deploying these to do anything. Oh, look, there's their only kilo class. And we know how well these things work.
Oh man, that looks like a piece of crap sitting there in the middle of that.
Man, I tell you. And here's some more of the Russians. The Iranian boats. Very hard to tell them apart from Russian ones. And here are their midget subs. Forgot to mention that they had these. They're basically useless. I think they have like crews of like 7 guys, and y'all can kind of tell because of how small they are. And they are absolutely useless, but they do have them, and they technically work, so they could try and use those in a war, but it would basically be a death sentence. Let's see if I can find y'all any more speedboats before we move on from this area. It looks like that was all of them, at least in Bandar Abbas. I might be able to find y'all some, though, down the way in Bushehr. They might have some more of them down here. Let's see. Let me take a quick... Yep, here's a few more of them. So they have a load of these speedboats just scattered around in normal open-air ports, so you could just bomb them, like just straight up with a normal high-explosive bomb, and that would be it. It wouldn't take anything incredibly extensive to be able to destroy the speedboat fleet. But I hope that does address that the best I can, and a big thanks to you for the support and helping this channel to keep on running. And thank you for helping us to make an interesting discovery, because I never looked into where they kept the speedboats, but they literally just keep them on trailers out in the open near the ports. But anyways, with that, we are on to the next one.
And our next question goes to EJ, who said, so if Israel's attacking these apartments, then why isn't Iran threatening to launch missiles at Israel?
That's because there's some plausible deniability involved in that the Iranians cannot definitively say that the Israelis conducted that action because it was conducted by an intelligence agency, and there's no clear and evident proof to point directly to the Israelis doing it. And that's generally what stops most countries from reacting to sabotage or anything along those lines, is because they don't know who really did it. Because while you could think that it's the Israelis doing that stuff in Bandar Abbas, what if it isn't? And then what if you attack the Israelis and they didn't do that? Then you just open up a war that you might not want it to enter, which I believe the Iranians really don't want to enter this one, although they will fight it. And they did that off of a false assumption. So that's why they generally haven't attacked the Israelis, is because there is no clear definitive proof to point the finger at Israel and justify attacks based off of that. But with that, I hope that does address that the best I can. And with that, we are on to the next one.
And our next one goes to Mariah, who said, do you think that the U.S. is trying to affect regime change or just eliminate Iran's nuclear capabilities? And how can the U.S. create regime change militarily?
Well, you can create regime change militarily by just basically wiping out anyone who's in the current government and then hoping that a new one forms. But generally the way that you would do that effectively is putting a large amount of forces on the ground to occupy the country and then create an interim government that would then start the process of creating a new permanent government. That's generally how you would do it, in the simplest of terms, and I would think that would be the most likely sort of an option for success. Conducting airstrikes and knocking out top leadership and most government officials sounds great on paper, but it leaves a power vacuum that we're not directly helping to fill, at least with an interim government, which could lead to a whole myriad of things happening, which would not be beneficial, or could not be beneficial. But anyways, I hope that does address that the best that I can. And with that, we're on to the next one.
And we also have one from Dynasty Shipper, who said, question for y'all. What's your opinion on AI fighter jets and combat simulations or situations, and how well could they do?
Well, Matthew, what do you think about that?
Me personally, I would say AI fighter jets, that the fighter jets really cannot be artificially ran by an AI. It can be wingmen. I think that's the current concept right now, is wingmen are the future of fighter, like combat in the sky. We can have AI wingmen, like drones that come along with like F-35s and things like that, but we can't have the F-35 itself being AI operated, at least yet, because we still really need someone in the main aircraft, like a real pilot, to actually make those decisions, because we can't turn over, like the kill chain completely to AI. That's a very risky maneuver to take, in my personal opinion. So I would say AI wingmen of the future, but not necessarily AI fighter jets.
I would say that AI definitely has a place in modern air wars as a force multiplier, but I don't think, like Matthew's saying, that they ever will take over complete air operations from human pilots, because human pilots need to be in the air to make the executive decisions for their wingmen and themselves on what they're going to be doing and how they're going to be doing it at the end of it all. It wouldn't be a great idea to have AI completely in charge of the Air Force, at least in terms of actual air operations, because if that happens, then you could see that there could be unfortunate collateral. Say they end up bombing civilians, or they end up bombing U.S. citizens, or they end up doing a whole other wide variety of things, or maybe even that they might be hijacked by foreign countries, which might also be a possibility as well. And I have a feeling that all of that generally makes it to where AI are never going to be completely autonomous, at least in an air war scenario, and they always will be either an assistant in an aircraft to a human pilot, or they will only be wingmen that will be still commanded and operated by a human pilot, but will make all of the meticulous decisions of actually flying the plane and executing the combat actions on its own with that knowledge. So with that, I hope that does address that the best I can. And a big thanks to you for the support and helping this channel to keep on running. And with that, we're on to the next one.
And we also have a question from Avari yet again. He said, the USA used to be armed to the teeth in the Middle East, and what have the current and prior administrations done to wipe away the U.S. military presence near Iran?
Oh, that's a great question right there, because this has actually been something that's been going on since the time of Obama. Because back in the day, well, I'll explain the whole situation. So when the whole situation with 9/11 happened, everyone wanted to go out for blood in the Middle East and go get the people who did this. So George Bush, just to lay out the whole sequence of events, was the one who sent basically the whole U.S. military, well, not the whole U.S. military, I'm kind of exaggerating with that, a significant portion of the U.S. military into the Middle East through Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, which was the invasion of Iraq, and the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. That's when you would see the largest deployments of U.S. forces in the region. And even still, it was actually undermanned, and that's actually kind of the shocking part about it, is that a lot of people say that we just like flooded the Middle East. What's crazy is that we did not flood Iraq well enough, because there was actually occupational plans that generally there's a ratio of soldiers that you want per citizens on the ground in a foreign country that you're occupying, and we never met that number in Iraq. Like, usually we were, well, according to some occupational plans, we should have been shooting for 1 soldier for every 80 civilians, but in reality, the number of forces that we had on the ground was about 1 soldier for every 200 civilians, which, as you can see, that number is far skewed. And because we had so few troops on the ground in Iraq, that allowed for the group, the Fedayeen, which was, let's see, Gaddafi, well, not Gaddafi, let me think. Saddam Hussein's personal bodyguard, and also the bodyguard for Uday and Qusay, they were able to go and arm themselves with the abandoned arsenals that still had all of the weaponry and explosives in them for the Iraqi army. And that's what started the insurgent era in Iraq. If we had actually held down Iraq properly and sent in enough ground forces into Iraq initially, at the very opening of the invasion, there would have never been an ability for the Iraqi resistance to become armed and actually create some form of an armed insurgency like they did later on. But it was that failing that actually led to the Battle of Fallujah in 2007, and also the incredibly dangerous outskirts of Baghdad, just to its northeast as well, which I believe was called the Death Triangle during that time. That was generally the reason why all of that happened. And because of the losses that the U.S. was taking in the prolonged occupation, because the occupation was done improperly at the start, it started to become unpopular with the U.S. public. But because the Bush administration had had its second term already, it didn't really matter too much if it was unpopular. It mattered that they had to keep going with the strategic imperative of trying to help out, basically shielding the new Iraqi government from direct attacks, so it could try and found itself strongly enough to where it wouldn't completely collapse immediately. The situation in Afghanistan was totally different, because as soon as we set up the Afghan government, or the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is what we called it, it was already clear that they were never really going to survive without direct U.S. support indefinitely. So we were already kind of getting that understanding back then. But still, that didn't really matter at the time. Then once Obama was elected in 2008, and he came into the office in 2009, that's generally when you would see that U.S. forces, particularly in Iraq, were pulled out. The reason why Obama was elected was, or at least on the foreign policy point, if we're talking about foreign policy, was because Obama worked off of a policy that U.S. soldiers need to be withdrawn from the Middle East because we don't need to be over there indefinitely. So once he was elected, we would see that most U.S. forces in Iraq would be withdrawn around 2010 to 2011. There were some U.S. forces within Iraq, but not in the large numbers that had been seen from about 2003 to about 2008, which was really the peak of U.S. force presence within Iraq. But the United States would still hold important air bases like the U.S. consulate in Erbil and the airfield outside of Erbil. We would also hold the Al-Assad airfield within western Iraq and Camp Victory in Baghdad, along with a couple of other locations and outposts in the country. And then in Afghanistan, because the situation was so bad, we basically didn't withdraw anyone out of Afghanistan. The Obama administration didn't, at least, because we knew that if we withdrew from Afghanistan then, the Afghan government was going to collapse. And then we took the approach, basically to try and kind of kick the can down the road, that if we stayed around for longer in Afghanistan, eventually the Afghan government might become solid and cohesive enough that it might be able to stand on its own. So that's how we justified staying in Afghanistan throughout both of Obama's terms from 2008 to 2016. Then when the Obama administration was ending around 2014 to 2016, that's when the rise of ISIS started to occur. And we saw that during the end of the Obama administration, much like the bungling of the invasion of Iraq in 2003 by Bush, there was a bungling of the rise of ISIS by Obama in 2014 to 2016, because it was already becoming politically unpopular in America to even suggest sending U.S. forces to the Middle East. So they didn't really want to send in U.S. forces to deal with ISIS. And CIA reports from the time were heavily understating the popularity of ISIS and also its rising prominence within Syria and Iraq. So really no U.S. military actions were taken in any heavy form against ISIS during 2014 to 16. By the time that Trump was elected for his first term, and he began to serve his term in 2017 in January, ISIS had become a fully planted force within Syria and Iraq and actually held a large amount of ground in the two countries. So that's when that's when Trump would actually send in forces back to the Middle East, and we would end up going on the war against ISIS. That's also what got us involved directly on the ground in the Syrian civil war from that point on. During the first term of Trump, there was a heavy emphasis on finally pulling out of Afghanistan, and based off the advisors at the time and also what the president was thinking, he was thinking that it would be a good idea to pull out, because whether the Afghan government stood on its own or not, it was costing a great deal of funds, and also it looked to be an unwinnable situation because we could never get an Afghan government to be stable enough in the country to really justify staying around for that long. So then in 2020, that's when we signed the Doha Accords with the Taliban to then withdraw, which was under Trump. Then when Biden came into office in 2021, just going through the whole sequence of events of why the Middle East is like it is today from presidency to presidency, when Biden came in, he was already dealing with a complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan, which he then completely screwed up to a whole other degree, and a whole bunch of people are still debating that to this day. But basically that led to Afghanistan looking like a complete U.S. military failure because of how we finally left that conflict. Then in Iraq, we basically saw that U.S. forces stayed at the same levels they were at, although during the Biden administration, it was made clear through an agreement with the Iraqis that eventually in 2026, which did happen this year, we would give up all U.S. military bases like Camp Victory, the Al-Assad Air Base, and the holdings that we had in Erbil back to the Iraqi government, and let them completely operate those autonomously as their own sovereign state, which was then followed through by the current Trump administration in the present day right now. So that is pretty much in a nutshell over the past 23 years or so how we ended up where we are today in the Middle East, where there's basically very little or no U.S. forces in most parts of the Middle East. We have basically no U.S. presence in Syria any longer. We have hardly a U.S. presence in Iraq. If anything, it's a semi-permanent presence. It's no longer a permanent one. We have no U.S. forces in Afghanistan. And outside of that, we still have our Gulf partners that we can base our U.S. forces in, but generally, at least in the actual conflict zones, we don't really have anyone there any longer. So I hope that does answer your question well, literally going from administration to administration with the successes and failures of all of them combined to lead us to what we're doing right now. And I thank you so much for asking. A great question. I hope that was the most thorough sort of a in-depth historical analysis of the past 23 years and how it all turned out. But anyways, with that, we are on to the third to last question of the night.
All right. And in the meantime, we got one more super chat that came in from Bruce Lee. And thank you very much, Bruce, for that $2 super chat. We do appreciate that. He said, check out the movie Stealth from 2005 and Quack.
Oh, and I will make sure to, and quack indeed. And a huge thanks to you so much for the support and helping this channel to keep on running. And with that, we're now on to the third to last question of the night.
And this one goes to Crunchy, who said, do you both see Syria will be the new hotbed in Syria of ISIS? And unfortunately, I think I do see it as being a new hotbed there. I would actually agree with that if that was your position. It seems to me that Jelani is not doing very much to stop ISIS in that country. In fact, it's rumored and also alleged that his guys have released ISIS prisoners in mass numbers. And in fact, it's so bad, the U.S. forces are panicking in the region still, trying to redirect them into prisons or keep them in prisons wherever they're at. So it seems to me like there's either a possible alliance between Jelani and that group, or perhaps maybe it's rogue men that he has under his command that are just doing whatever they want and releasing their friends in ISIS. Whatever the case is, it's not good. And it seems like Syria, which is unfortunately a constant hotbed of bad activities like that, is going to probably plunge even further into it. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would say that generally the rise of ISIS is basically guaranteed at this point in Syria. Right now, the U.S. government has done nothing to curb the Jelani regime from being what it is. And we've also seen that they made basically no response to them releasing thousands of ISIS fighters. It's pretty much guaranteeing that there's a situation on the ground where ISIS will be able to resurge and reform itself within Syria at the moment, considering that the Jelani government is incredibly benevolent, in fact, sympathetic to them. And because of that, I think that we're probably going to be having to go back in the Middle East on the ground, like we did in the middle of the 2010s, to go and deal with ISIS again a second time. That could have been avoided if we acted proactively, but we didn't, so we're now going to have to deal with the situation as it is, and then have to figure that one out. So with that, I hope that does address that the best that I can. And with that, it is time for us to get on and into our final question of the night. And so, who is the lucky last person who threw in the lucky last question of the night?
And that viewer is going to be none other than Romanel, who said, does an Iranian collapse derail or stop a Chinese invasion of Taiwan? And they'd even have less oil for it. And would it also force a peace in Ukraine?
And not necessarily. Iran is largely completely contained to the Middle East. It would be a very beneficial outcome for the Middle East, but it really wouldn't affect the Chinese situation all too much, because what's kind of funny is that right now the President of the United States is pretty much pushing the Chinese and the Indians to just buy Venezuelan oil instead of Iranian oil. So... You know, and also Russian oil for that matter. So basically, we're supplanting their oil supply with Venezuelan oil. So it really will have no impact on their strategic outlook if that's followed through on. But it will be a positive outlook for us in the Middle East, because if nobody else steps up to fund and support Hamas, Houthis, or the Hezbollah forces in Lebanon, we'll generally see that the Middle East becomes a lot more of a stable place and may actually start to become economically successful area outside of the Gulf states that we're already involved with at the moment. But with that, I hope that does address that.
Also, real quick here, check Flight Radar 24 and see if there's any movement. I'm seeing someone in the chat saying that there could be some movement happening right now. Well, I'm curious to see if that's actually true.
Well, let's see. Let's see what we got here. Oh, we gotta wait for this thing to load. Oh,
that's slow. Look at this. Look at this thing. It's having a problem.
Oh, here we go. Sometimes it does that whenever I click off it on air, but let's see here. So, I'm not seeing really anything exceptional. Just to be completely honest, it looks fairly normal in most areas of the world right now.
Anything leaving the U.S. that seems to be big?
Well, we have some Russian flights that are going to Dakar. It looks like 2 IL-96s. That's pretty interesting. But nothing really out of the United States right now. There's just a odd tanker here and there flying around. Well, an E-6 Mercury actually flying around. But there's basically nothing going on. So looks like that might have been a red herring a little bit.
False alarm. False alarm.
But with that, folks, it is actually time for us to end out our stream for the night. I got to thank you all so much once again for enjoying this stream tonight, and I hope that you all found it to be, hopefully, very informative and very well researched. We have had a peak viewership tonight of a whopping 16.4 thousand people. That's a lot of people, and 130,000 people have watched this stream before it ended. Shoo! That is a lot of folks. And I gotta say, we are massively appreciative and entirely honored to know that so many of y'all consider this channel to be your primary source of news. And of course, folks, we will see you all on Tuesday at 10 p.m. Eastern Time to cover the next 48 hours of the news from around the world. And if there is a short war video to be made, I, the Enforcer, will be the one making that short war video tomorrow. I also got to give a huge shout out to y'all for raising over $3,000 to Nova Ukraine. Holy moly!
Holy moly! Whoa!
An absolutely unbelievable amount. Incredible to see and great to know that so many people continue to support the fundraisers that the Leaf Spring Army is running to help out people from around the world. And so with that, folks, we will see you all either tomorrow for the short war video or at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday for the next 48 hours of the news from around the world. And so with that, good night, good luck, take care, stay safe. Slava Ukraini, Ram Slava, long live the Leaf Spring Army, and long live the Republic.
And with that, folks, we will see you all on Tuesday night at 10 p.m. Eastern for the next Nightly War News stream. And there will be no stream tomorrow because it is a Monday. We are off on Monday. Excuse me. But maybe there will be a short war video tomorrow midday as well if there is enough news to cover. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, thank you all for helping us to raise over $3,200 tonight. A whopping big goal right there. And we do appreciate the generosity very, very much. And a huge shout out to the 130,000 people that joined us by the end. And we appreciate every single one of you for choosing us as your news source. And we will see you all once again on Tuesday for certain. And in the meantime, Slava Ukraine, Herom Slava, get some rest, and good night.
Army shall